Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Exploring Emotional Sobriety Provides a Life That Flourishes with Dr. Ellen Berger and Herb Kagan. Both Dr. Berger and Herb are committed to getting together and presenting on emotional sobriety in future events like these. And thank you for the Retreat Center in supporting Dr. Berger and Herb on their efforts of spreading their knowledge and insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya, so much. My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic, and that's perhaps incidental to the gathering of people on this call. It's certainly not to me. 1984 is my sobriety date. Dr. Berger was actually the clinical director at that hospital where I found a recovery. I wasn't in the hospital. My wife was for her recovery, but I was willing to support her recovery, and I got caught in the draft. A big surprise, but it wasn't a surprise to anybody else. It was a surprise to me. And eventually Dr. Berger became my therapist. I like his style. He was a Marine, and quite frankly, he still is a Marine. I was a monk, and quite frankly, I'm still a monk. And so we call ourselves the monk and the Marine. It's kind of an interesting contrast. Dr. Berger?
Well, thanks, Herb, and welcome everyone on this Sunday morning. And it's a perfect morning for it, isn't it? It's a little overcast, and I'm out in Westlake, California, and it's raining out here, so it's perfect to be here with you guys and huddling down this morning. My journey in recovery started back in 1971, right after I came back from Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam combat veteran. I went in the Marine Corps at 17 to address my problem with alcohol, and came back from Vietnam with a problem with alcohol and other drugs. But it did work. I ended up getting involved in treatment in the summer of 1971. I was the third Marine admitted into a program that was just signed into orders by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, called the Drug Exemption Program. And at that point in time, the way they treated Vietnam vets with drug problems was just to discharge us and let the problem, be the community's responsibility to address. But the Marine Corps decided that they were going to step up and try to help us. And so they created this drug exemption program. And I was very fortunate to be the third Marine admitted in the program. The third day the program was in operation. And obviously it was new. They didn't have much idea about what they were doing, but they did one thing right, is they turned to the 12-step community. And there happened to be a group of young people who found this new way of life with this woman called Flowbird. They were called Flowbird's Birds. And one of them, his name is Tom McCall, was invited to come out and share his story with us on a Tuesday night. It was the Tuesday night drug rap session. So if you can get this picture, about 20 Marines in our combat fatigues, all squared away, which meant that our blouses are starched and our boots are shined, and we got our regulation haircuts on, and then this hippie walks in. He's in a pair of khaki shorts, Birkenstock shoes, a wrinkled Hawaiian shirt, and his hair pulled back in a ponytail. So it was a real strange juxtaposition of energy. I was quite skeptical myself. What does this guy have to say to us? He was probably out protesting the war while we were over there, putting our lives and fighting this war, putting our lives at risk. But after about 5 minutes, all of those differences disappeared. Well, what I experienced was somebody that was incredibly courageous and authentic. He talked about things that I felt, but I wouldn't dare give voice to. He shared things that I experienced, but I didn't want to ever tell anybody else about those experiences. And his authenticity that night just leveled the playing field. I mean, I was all in. What I say all the time is that I experienced an emotional freedom in Tom that night, that he was comfortable being himself. And I was never comfortable being myself. The only time that I experienced that was when I was either drunk or when I was high. But the rest of the time, I didn't have that experience. And here was somebody that was okay with himself without using any drugs, including alcohol. And I wanted that. I had a thought to myself that if I could have that in my life, life could work. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, "How did you do that?" And he told me. He says, "You know, I found this new way of life through working these steps. And if you stick close, I'll show you how to do it." And I did. That was in the summer of 1971. I'm glad to say today that Tom is still my sponsor after 49 years. We're still connected. I talk to him almost on a weekly basis, still consult him for things I'm struggling with in life. And our relationship, of course, has changed, but I still consider him my sponsor. And I feel very, very fortunate to have someone like that in my life. So after I got clean and sober, the program didn't have any counselors. So they invited me to come on board. I had about 60 days sobriety. Today, you couldn't get a job as a counselor if you had 60 days anywhere. But I was hopefully one step ahead of some of the guys coming in. Sometimes I'm not so sure I was. And I came on board, and I now fell in love with helping people and working with people and being a counselor. And I really said that this is now my purpose in life. This is what I want to do. So I decided that being a clinical psychologist would be a good thing. So I had to go back to school. I was a high school dropout. You know, high school got in the way of my drinking, so I didn't have time for that. So I went back to school and, you know, one class at a time, one day at a time. And in 1987, I graduated with a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of California, Davis. So those were the three, if you will, the three-legged stool that my recovery was resting on, is being turned on to recovery, because I got turned on to the possibility of living a different life. And I say this all the time, there's two kinds of motivations. One motivation comes from pain. It's called a deficit motivation, is what Maslow talked about. That's a good motivation. It's powerful, right? You got a toothache, you're going to move heaven and earth to get to that dentist and get that toothache taken care of. The problem with that kind of motivation, and we see it all the time in terms of recovery, people come out of the gates because they're hurting and they're sprinting to get better. But once they start to feel better, they stop, right? They don't continue the journey. The second kind of motivation, which I'm very fortunate to have tapped into, is what we call a growth motivation. It's the desire to be what you can be. And when you get bitten by that, which Herb has been bit by that motivation, I've had a chunk of me taken out with that motivation. We're here forever. And it's always a journey. And that's what Herb and I have shared. As he shared with you, we had a professional relationship before. And then he came to me one day and says, "Hey, there's this guy, Richard Rohr. I think you'd like him. You want to come to a workshop with me?" I said, "God, I'm all in." And that started our journey together. We did that workshop. We went to an initiation retreat. So Herb and I are initiated men, in case you guys wondered. We've been through an initiation process, which sometimes I'm not sure what that means anymore, but we did it, and it was an incredible experience. And we've attended many of Richard's workshops and presentations. And so our relationship started to grow, and I came to him with this emotional sobriety stuff. And I say, "Look, I know, you're into helping people with the steps, and I just see this is such an important part." And then later on, we both discovered that Bill even said the steps are designed to help you achieve emotional sobriety. That is the ultimate goal of our recovery. And that has opened up a whole new world for me. And it's exciting because it's taken my recovery and the people that I get a chance to work with and the people that Herb and I share with, it's taken our recoveries to the next level. It really has. We've used the word amplified recovery to describe it, optimal recovery. It's such a powerful, powerful set of ideas and concepts that just unlocks to me the secret of life. And look, that's what I'm excited to be able to share with you today. And I know Herb is as excited to do this. We love doing our workshops together, which we did about 3 or 4 times a year. And we just spent a day sharing this knowledge. And, many people at the end of it, said, my God, there was so much information there. And Herb had this great line. He says, yeah, it's kind of like we know you're thirsty and you come up to take a drink from the fire hydrant and we just open it up. It's you get a lot more than you're thirsty for. But what I have found is that all of the information, some of which will be immediately available to your consciousness, seeds are going to be planted. Ideas are going to be planted today. And those are going to grow in your recovery, and just like they've grown in mine. So I think that's about all I want to share about that today. What we wanted to start with today was Bill's letter. And in a minute, I'll share my screen, but once I do, you won't be able to see me in this way. This letter is incredibly important, and it's important for a lot of different reasons. First of all, let me put the context that this letter was written in, and actually appeared as an article published in 1958. It was written in 1956. There was a person in California that was in the fellowship, wrote back to the General Service Office in New York and says, look, I've been struggling with depression. I'd like to know, has anyone had any experience in applying the steps to deal with their depression? Well, Bill, I can only imagine this. I don't know this, but I have a vivid imagination, as I think we all do. I imagine Bill was jumping for joy when he heard that, because that had been what Bill had struggled with through his whole recovery. And so in 1956, this is 21 years into Bill's journey. And as we know from what listening to Bill's talks, as well as from biographies that have been written and what other people have shared, is Bill was a seeker. He really tried to understand what was going on with my depression. What was happening? How can I understand this? And most importantly, how can I turn it around? So that's what he had been doing. Just like for me, when I was in school, every opportunity I had, I tried to plug in, recovery and understanding change and what needs to take place to change. I think Bill was looking at the program, not only for his physical sobriety, but for his emotional sobriety, which meant relief from his depression, as well as some of the other things that he struggled with. So, he gets this letter and he starts to put pen to paper, which Bill, I think, enjoyed doing a lot. And he wrote a response to this gentleman. I think that this letter is a synopsis of what he learned up to this point in time. It synthesizes all of his ideas and concepts. These ideas are prevalent even early on in the big book, when he talks about that one section where we're the actor thinking we're the director and we want to run the show and stuff like that. And when people don't go along with us, we get upset and angry and step on the toes of others and all that. But in the 12 and 12, it's just riddled, this whole idea of emotional sobriety, through all of the steps. And that's another workshop that Herb and I do, is we take people through the steps and talk about how they help people achieve emotional sobriety. And we'll be offering that down the road here. But today our purpose is to give you an introduction to this whole idea. And I think that there's no better way to do that than to share with you Bill's letter, and Herb and I will make our comments and narrate it as best as we can. Herb, before I share that screen, do you want to say anything about this letter?
Well, yeah, in fact, I just had an insight as you were talking, thinking about the chronology of it all. Bill wrote the 12 and 12 in the late 40s, actually, and published it in 1951 as a mechanism to package with the commentary he had on the traditions. It was actually a byproduct of his attempt to get the traditions approved. But what struck me was that he wrote the 12 and 12 commentary on the steps and published them in 1951. And then in 1956, when he was responding to this person, he was using some of the insight that he had in the development of the commentary on the steps, where he talks generously about emotional sobriety. So he had done an awful lot of thinking and put it to paper previous to that. And I had never seen that connection until you started mentioning it. So yeah, that's about it. Speaking about the two motives, Bill had said in such a black and white way, we don't need any, speaking of traditions, we don't need any rules or regulations. These are guidelines based on our experience. He said there's only two disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. We could say that there's only two disciplines with regard to the broad landscape of addiction. There are only two disciplines. One is God and one is the addiction. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. So you're either drawn out of an excitement for the recovery and the growth that's available, or you're pushed there because of the suffering that you want to reduce and remedy. And so it's that carrot and the stick. And I think the combination is normally the human journey. Father Rohr, one of our teachers, as Dr. Berger mentioned, he says, most people come to transformation through either great love or great suffering. 98% of the people, unfortunately, come because of suffering. So it's just a complete reinforcement of the human condition. And that's what we're talking about here with emotional sobriety, is really the human condition and the next phase of development. Thanks, Alan.
Oh, that's great. So I'm going to be sharing my screen now with you. Whoa, I don't want that one. I want this one. There we go. Okay, so let us go ahead. As I said, this is going to be Bill's letter on emotional sobriety. It was written in 56. It was actually published under the title of Emotional Sobriety, The Next Frontier in 1958 in the Grapevine. And it also appears in a collection of Bill's talks that have been transcribed, along with other letters he has written, in the book called The Language of the Heart. And that has also just been released on audio as well. So let's go ahead and dig into this.
I think many oldsters who have put our booze cure to severe but successful tests still find that they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say, humility, in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God.
So I used to say that this was the first time that I found the phrase emotional sobriety. It turned out that wasn't true. It also appears in the 12 and 12 when Bill is discussing step number 12. We'll talk about that later. Now, Bill hoped at this point that this would be the spearhead for the next major development in AA. And there's very good reason why he anticipated this. And we'll be getting into this. And when I talk later on this morning, after Herb digs into steps 10, 11, and 12, I'll give you some of my ideas about, I think, what happened that it really never took off. I think the good news is, and what's exciting for me, and I think for Herb as well, is we're starting to see this become more and more of a topic of people in recovery. And I'm very, very excited about that development. Now, he defines it here as real maturity and balance. Now, later on, we're going to talk about this. We can talk about this as real emotional maturity and the balance in our life. We think about living a balanced life, but we're also going to be talking about keeping an emotional balance, meaning that you have to be aware of your emotional center of gravity. Well, Bill gives us some idea about what emotional maturity and keeping your emotional center of gravity or balance means. He says, or what it takes to achieve that. And it takes humility. And he says that we have to have humility in relationship with ourselves. We have to have that in relationship with our fellows, and humility in relationship with the God of our understanding. Or as I like the word Herb likes to use with it, with the mystery, right? With the mystery. So let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to be humble in this context? Well, I think to be humble means that we're right-sized in some way. So being right-sized with ourselves, meaning not to have ridiculous expectations about who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to function in this world. And we'll get into that more and more as we talk about this. But early on in life, we all come up with an idea, and what we'll refer to today as our false self or idealized self, of who we have to be all right, who we have to be loved, to be accepted, and to belong. And we dedicate ourselves to actualizing this concept. And that becomes a very black and white deal. If my idea is to be a nice guy, then I have to be a nice guy, even if somebody's stepping on my toes. So that's this idea of being humble means giving up these ideas of who we have to be and being more concerned with being who we are. And that's a big shift in consciousness. And so our expectations towards ourselves change. Well, if I'm going to be doing a number on myself in terms of expectations, you can rest assured I'm going to also do that to you. And so the expectations I have on myself are also going to show up with rules I have for how you're supposed to behave, especially how you're supposed to behave so that I'm okay. And that's the emotional immaturity, right? That this emotional immaturity is that I expect you to take care of me. I expect you to behave in a certain way to make me feel good. I make you responsible for my emotions. And with humility, we release people from those expectations, from our unenforceable rules, as we'll talk about. And Herb, I'll let you speak to how this humility shows up in our relationship with God. But as you can see, what Bill is calling for is for us to show up in our lives in a very, very different way. Is to let go of this idea that life is supposed to conform to our expectations, and instead to see ourselves as being tasked with being able to deal with what life is putting before us. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Herb.
All right. So, wow, we could spend the entire time just going back and forth and unpacking your comments and then my comments, as we do normally. It's quite exciting. And by the way, we don't have a script. We have lots of information and experience, and we bounce off one another in a very enjoyable way, at least from our standpoint. The word humility actually comes from the Latin humus, Humas, which means earth or dirt. And not to diminish, but to have a perspective that we're one of many, and it's common as, not special or unique. Bill has a wonderful treatise on humility in chapter 7 of the 12 and 12, where he talks about the role of humility. And in step 6 and 7 in the 12 and 12, he talks about these are the steps that are the rite of passage that Dr. Berger was talking about, especially for men who don't have in the Western civilization any real formal sense of a rite of passage. There's parallel kinds of things like getting a driver's license or going into the service or graduating from college, but it's not quite the same as an emotional and or spiritual ritual that actually brings us through to a sense of perspective that Dr. Berger was just talking about. If you were to really embrace and understand and experience the one sentence that he said, it would be worth the entire time that we're together today. And that was, reality just is. Let it sink in for just a minute. Reality just is. It's not good or bad. It's not fair or unfair. It's not even healthy or unhealthy. Reality just is. And successful living is adjusting ourselves to reality, not attempting to shape reality to our needs, our feelings, our thoughts, our expectations, and our story. Everybody has a story. Most people don't know they have a story. And they especially don't know that most of the story is a delusion and a lie. And that's why we suffer, and that's why other people around us suffer, because we're projecting ourselves onto reality. We don't see reality as it is, we see reality as we are. And humility is standing back and having this healthy perspective that reality just is, and I will be successful and live a healthy life, a flourishing life, if I accept and adjust. I don't mean passively surrendering to being steamrollered. I don't mean that at all. That's not humility. That's some form of shame and guilt. What I'm talking about, and Alan said it, having our center of gravity deep within ourselves. I love that phrase. He coined it from my standpoint. Having our center of gravity deep in ourselves so that we're not puppets on strings attached to events and circumstances. The process of the steps for me cut those strings. The process of therapy additionally cut those strings so that now I don't have buttons that people press. So I don't react in an unhealthy way to circumstances or people. You can't press my button because I don't have them. Thanks to the step work of a vital spiritual life and additional professional help, which I needed at a deep level. Alan, thanks.
Well, what you're saying is so important. You and I have talked many times about the importance of being aligned with reality.
Yeah, that's the word I use. Yeah.
Right? And that's what you're saying about in terms of our ability to adapt to and respond. You can take the word responsible and break it into being able to response able.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're talking about. There is no passivity in what we're talking about. There's acceptance. You hear that what we're really describing is an acceptance of what is. But that acceptance is something you do. It's not something that just happens. It takes a very, very active relationship to what you're experiencing to get to that place. And, your emphasis on this, Herb, is very, very important, is we are not promoting a passivity in any way at all. What we are promoting is a certain way of being in relationship to your experience. And what we know is the kind of relationship you have to your experience is what's going to determine your happiness. It's what's going to determine your serenity. It's going to determine whether you flourish or don't flourish in your life. Because you're going to have experience. We can guarantee that. It's just how you process it, how you digest it, how you show up to deal with it is what really is going to count.
Well, so many people, especially in the program, hear the word, and it sounds cool. It sounds appropriate, surrender, especially when you come to the third step. But the word surrender is not in the big book. The word surrender itself, no place in the first 164 pages is the word surrender. And when I looked at and really understood and experienced step 3, which I was 10 years sober going through this step work for the third time, I realized, step 3 is not a passive surrender. Step 3 is a active turning. With my free will, I choose to be in alignment with my understanding of God's will or the flow of reality. That's where I coined the phrase alignment. The word alignment's not in the big book, but if you look at my hands right now, there's a life force flow, and I have free will, and I can go against the life force. That's what steps 4 through 9 is all about. is my acts of willfulness, acts contrary to my best interest and nature itself. And the whole point of step 3, watch my hands, is the turning to be in alignment with the flow of reality. Now, I have capital F and a capital R in my vocabulary interpretation of what that means. I make a decision to turn. That's a ferocious act of my will. It is absolutely not passive at all. It's all the energy that I can muster to make that commitment and then to do steps 4 through 9. And what I realize is I made a commitment to turn. And when I finished step 9, I realized I was turned. And that's that grace connected to my willingness to take action. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, let's look at the next slide.
Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57.
Well, boy, it's this idea that we want top approval, which is Bill's way of saying we want everyone to like us. Perfect security. I want to feel good all the time. It's our pain phobia is such a problem, and it's such a setup for those of us that become addicted. Because, we've got this idea that we should be comfortable all the time. Perfect romance, our relationship just works, right? Our partner does everything we want them to when we want them to do it. So we set ourselves up with these ideas that everybody has to like us, we have to feel good all the time, that our relationship should be perfect. Well, this is an impossible way of life. I think it's an impossible way of life when you're 17, and even when you're 47 or 57 or 68 years old or whatever age you are.
Or 80.
Or 80 years old. It just puts us into, like when Herb held up his hands, we're always in conflict because of these things. We're always trying to wrestle satisfaction or our self-esteem from what's going on around us.
Talk about should, Alan, in that.
Well, it's such an important thing, and you'll see that this idea about who we should be and how things should be and how life is supposed to be, all the variations on that are a big part of what keeps us from being able to deal with life. As you'll see later on, I don't want to get too much into what I'm going to talk to you about. Yeah. But when we put these shoulds, or what we say, when we should all over everything, we create a mess in our lives, a real mess. And we'll get into that more later. He calls these adolescent urges, but what we see is that these are urges that everybody has, because that's what our false self does. It says, this is what has to happen for me to be okay. I need to be loved. I need to be accepted. I need to feel like I belong. And we come up with all of these ideas on how we're going to achieve that. And those that are ideas, at that point, we construct this. We think it's a blueprint for our salvation. It turns out to be a blueprint for our destruction.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I believe Bill's insight in step 10 says we're not cured. It's not about not being cured of our addiction, because he says very clearly we're placed in a position of neutrality there in step 10. We've entered the world of the spirit. But we're not cured of our human instincts. We're not cured of our inclinations. We're not cured of our emotions. We need to, on a daily basis, have the tools to be able to contain and manage our instincts in our body and our emotions in our limbic system. And that's really the whole key to emotional sobriety, is having the perspective from our humanity, our thinking, and our ability to manage the direction of these energies that are both in us for our physical survival as well as our emotional survival.
Okay.
Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all those areas because of my failure to grow up, emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover finally that all along we had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round.
Well, this is such an important part. And every time I hear this letter, I'm so impressed with Bill's awareness and insight and his humility. He talks about his failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually, that he was demanding the impossible. You see, when I demand that life be the way that I think it should be, I'm demanding the impossible. I'm unable to control life. You know, life is what it is. As Herbs talks about, reality is only reality 100% of the time. When he says we had the cart before the horse, well, if I keep demanding my environment to be a certain way to support me, then I'm putting the cart before the horse instead of figuring out how to support myself to deal with my environment. So you're now hearing what maturity is. It's the transcendence of environmental support to self-support. That's what emotional maturity looks like.
Environment meaning both circumstances as well as people.
Yeah, circumstances, people, that's right. Circumstances and people, that's what we look for. God, this has to be, I have to have that to be okay, right? I've got to buy that house, or I have to have that car, I've got to have those shoes, or that handbag, or I have to have my wife, you know, tell me 10 times a day that she loves me for me to feel okay, or cook me dinner. Whatever our expectations are, they're a setup.
And this is totally countercultural. So we're fighting huge forces in our at least in our Western culture, that conspire against us, because the TV ads and the magazine ads and the movie ads hold up the criteria or litmus test of success. And it's not necessarily mental health.
So true. It's so interesting. I was watching the show about advertisement and public relations, right? And PR campaigns and stuff like that. And so they use Q-tips as an example of this. Is that before Q-tips were designed, nobody realized that they had a need for a Q-tip. And then as soon as they developed a Q-tip, now they went on such a campaign, you know, you panic if you run out of Q-tips at home, right? I mean, it's like we've gotten so dependent on it. We have been, you know, programmed, and we buy into this idea that we need certain things to be okay. And what Herb and I have discovered, and I think along with Bill Wilson, we need to be a certain way to be okay. We don't need things to be a certain way to be okay. We don't need other people to be a certain way. We have to find a way to get right with ourselves and to get right with the world. That's where emotional sobriety lies.
Well, that's where acceptance and attitude both cooperate to create a sense of stability and a sense of balance and a sense of serenity.
How to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, and so into easy, happy, and good living. Well, that's not only the neurotic's problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to hew to right principles in all of our affairs.
You know, Bill could also say, replace the word translate with the word integrate. So how to integrate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, because that's really what this is all about. We're going to give you certain information and knowledge, and you're going to understand from an intellectual point of view, you know, the sense that this makes, because it really does. It makes very good sense what we're going to talk about today. But now being able to live it and plug it in is going to take some work. It's going to take practice to integrate it. And, that's kind of like the arc of learning. And let's talk about that a little bit in terms of what does that arc look like? Well, you start with what we call unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't know kind of a thing is the way we've talked about it. And then in recovery, you become conscious of your incompetence. Now you become aware of what you don't know. What that leads to is now practicing conscious competence. Now we start to work on these things. We start to become aware of our shortcomings. We start to become aware of what we're going to talk about as our basic flaw and how we put these expectations. Our awareness is so important in this process. As you practice that, guess what happens? Now you become unconsciously competent. And now it's a part of your life. It becomes a part of your behavior. I've seen that happen in Herb's life. At first, he had to work the steps. Now the steps work him. He doesn't have a choice anymore. It's like he's taken on, he's going down that river because it's now been integrated into his body, into his soul, into his mind. So that's what Bill is talking about here.
It's interesting because 10, 15 years ago, we didn't know the brain could change. And although we heard the spiritual principles, especially in the rooms, talked about that take direction, acts contrary to your will. Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA, a psychiatrist, has done a lot of work in brain, understanding the brain. And with a lot of electronic spectrographs and whatever else, he's been able to identify it doesn't matter what you know, and it doesn't matter how you feel. If you want to change, it does matter what you do. And the interesting thing is when you do differently, when you behave differently, you change the neuronal synapses in your brain. I know that's a technical term. All it means is that these nerve endings begin to fire in a different way, and they begin to wire in a different way. And we literally change our biology. Oh my God, really? We didn't know this 15 years ago. We change our brain biology by behaving different, not with new information and not with new feelings. With new behavior, we change the neuronal patterns in our brain. And he coined the phrase, I think he coined it, synapses that fire together, wire together, and we create new habits of seeing, new habits of feeling, new habits of knowing, but especially new habits of doing. So it doesn't matter what we know, and it doesn't matter what we feel. It does matter what we do. And therefore, our sponsors, way back when, not even knowing that information, were correct in the conclusion. Thanks, Alan.
Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many AA oldsters have come to. And it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task.
So now Bill is talking about what I was referring to earlier about what happens when we're young and we decide that we have this, what we call basic anxiety, that we're not going to be loved, we're not going to be accepted, we're not going to belong. That's the fear that he's referring to here, this unconscious fear. So when we were young, it wasn't unconscious. And even as adults, it's not unconscious. It surfaces a lot of times. Well, what we did to deal with that created these compulsions. I must be a certain way to be okay. That's the phony aspiration, is that if I can pull this off perfectly, then I'm going to be fine. That's why at the heart of each and every one of us is a perfectionism, because this idea we had about who we had to be or who we should be really was an absolute deal. We had to be that or else. Now, how can that be brought in line with, I like to say, with reality, right? With reality. Well, we have to see where we're not in line with reality. We have to become aware of what he calls the dumb and raging Mr. Hyde. That becomes our main task, is to become aware of this part of us that is outrageous, that is demanding, that is quite arrogant in so many ways. And that's our job, is to become aware of this part, and then to learn how to deal with that side of us so that we can achieve emotional sobriety.
But and that's the way we're built. You're not talking about negative things. You're not talking about unhealthy things in the sense of the basic structure. In terms of its manifestation, yes, but not in terms of its basic structure. And Bill says in the 12 and 12, instincts gone awry. These are biological instincts of fight, flight, and freeze. They're instincts for survival. These are very healthy. And in the limbic system, those instincts gets translated into emotions of resentment, anger, and fear, and shame, and guilt. These are all methods of survival as a animal and as a biological being. Now, fortunately, we have a cortex that is attempting to manage all of that, but not unless you're conscious that, in fact, you can have some responsibility and some influence over all these things. And that's what we're doing here today, is to surface the intelligence about the resources and the tools that make us conscious so that we can, in fact, manage this. Dr. Berger, you have a great phrase. We encourage the best in us to manage the worst in us. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's such an important thing, what you're saying. Well, first of all, let's say it this way. Only the best in you can see the worst in you. So that's always the first step, is that when you're getting honest with yourself, and it's not easy, you're going to see some things about yourself that you're not going to like. And it's very important to endure and tolerate that discomfort and not run away from it. We know that change is paradoxical. You have to own what's true before you can have another possibility. I had to admit my powerlessness before I could find another power. I mean, there's no way around that. And people try to jump over that step all the time. I'm not going to tell you I'm a liar. I'm just going to try to get honest. Sorry. You got to first own that you're a liar. And as soon as you own you're a liar, now you start to become honest. It's the paradox. And see, that's what we've got to get. It's not by being what you think you should be to be okay. It's being who you are will then open the door to a new possibility. And that's the excitement about recovery. It really is the discovery of new possibilities. So only the best in us can see the worst in us. We want the best in us to be in charge. Emotional sobriety is about achieving that, is about coordinating all that you are and having an appropriate balance to it so that the best in you is running the show. Now, Herb said something else very important, is that there's when we talk about instincts gone awry, one basic instinct we have that is so powerful is this desire to move towards wholeness. It's called self-actualization. It's a growth force. So even that force goes awry. So when I take that desire to be whole, and let's say early on, there are some things going on in my family that are traumatic, or I experienced a loss, and I feel my emotional security is threatened, or my self-acceptance is threatened, well, then I'm going to come up with who I have to be okay. I'm going to make an adaptation. We used to call these defense mechanisms, but we dropped that idea because they were too negative. Is what we're trying to do is ensure our existence. So whatever we come up with as a child to survive the situation that we're surviving is an adaptation. It's a creative adaptation, because you've taken what's available, the best of what's available, to try to figure out how to get through that scene. And that's an amazing thing. And you're doing that because you want to ensure your wholeness, your existence. Now, later on, we call it an instinct that's gone awry because you have to make certain compromises to pull that off early on. You can't come from in a position of integrity because you're a child. But now as an adult, we can be thoughtful of these things. And now we can start to put ourselves together. You know, if you think of yourself as Humpty Dumpty, we want you to put yourself together in a whole different way. It's not that's what you did was bad when you were a child, or that it was a terrible thing. It is what it is. You are what you are. Now you have an opportunity to become what you can be. And that's where the good news is.
Well, in basic psychology, they have a concept of conditioned behavior.
Yeah.
And this is the mechanism where at the animal level and the vegetable level that we get reinforcement for certain behaviors that provide something that we think we want. And that becomes a habit. We talked earlier about our culture. There's a lot of subliminal description as to the litmus test of what is healthy and what is successful. And we absorb that consciously or especially unconsciously. The good news is that you can, in fact, what they call extinguish that conditioning, but it takes a lot of work. What Alan was just talking about is naming it. If you can't name it, then you can't tame it. Again, I'm quoting Dr. Berger, or maybe the whole psychologists. In order to grow and deal with life in a healthy way, we need to name what is going on in terms of our thoughts and our feelings, and especially our behavior. And Bill introduces how it works in chapter 5 by saying rigorous honesty is the key. Rigorous honesty with ourselves and rigorous honesty with other people. I asked my sponsor, what did that mean? And he said, transparency. I said, what does that mean? He said, your insides and your outsides match.
Right on. Very good.
I've recently come to believe that this can be achieved. I believe so because I begin to see many benighted ones, folks like you and me, commencing to get results. Last autumn, depression, having no really rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depressions, it wasn't a bright prospect. I kept asking myself, why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? By the hour, I stared at the St. Francis prayer. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. Here was the formula, all right. But why didn't it work?
Now, we're going to put a bookmark here. We're going to come back and talk about that because we're going to flip this concept around on its head later on.
Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression.
So this was Bill's great insight into what was underlying his depression. He identified it as his basic flaw. And he said that his flaw had been dependence. He said almost absolute dependence. Later on in this letter, he calls it emotional dependency. That his almost absolute dependent on people or circumstances to supply him with prestige, security, and the like. So we can see that he was completely dependent on his environment for his self-esteem. He was completely dependent on his environment for his self-regulation or his emotional regulation. He couldn't regulate himself. Things had to go his way for him to be okay. And that's where the trouble lies. Because if I am dependent on things going my way, I have to become really good at manipulating you and circumstances. Because my sense of self, my emotional security, my emotional well-being, my self-esteem depends on my ability to get you to do what I want you to do. And that's manipulation. He goes on to talk about, his, failing to get these things according to his perfectionist dreams and specifications, we could call it according to his should demands. He fought for them. And then when defeat came, so did his depression. So when he tried to control and manipulate those situations and people around him, and it didn't turn out, he would try to press his position further. And when people didn't go along with it, all he could do was be deflated and become depressed. And that was the formula. That's what he discovered was creating his depression. And it's so important to be aware of what is. Back to what I said before. This is the paradoxical theory of change. I have to own what I'm doing before I can do something differently. Okay, Herb, it's all yours.
The acceptance of reality, and we talked about that earlier. And it's not a passive acceptance. It's perceiving what is real. The Serenity Prayer is a fabulous prayer when we understand it. About 25 years ago, I jettisoned the word control because I realized doing the steps more than once that I don't have any control. No, literally, I have no control, internally or externally. I substitute the word influence. I have some influence externally, not much, but some. I have some influence internally. Not 100%, but some, enough, and more than I do outside of me. But I have influence. And the Serenity Prayer says, be able to distinguish what you can influence and what you can't. Pay attention. That's a mantra. Pay attention. They call that wisdom in the prayer itself. The wisdom is knowledge based on experience, which comes from making mistakes and correcting them. That's wisdom. Knowledge based on actions, based on experience, based on making mistakes and correcting them. And with more consciousness, we're able to see the mistakes earlier and make adjustments that are more realistic and learn from them so that we're not repeating this. What's the definition of insanity today? Of course, Dr. Berger. I say doing the same thing over again, expecting different results. And you say?
We expect better results. We don't expect them to be different. We're not that humble. We think they're going to be better. That's how arrogant we are. Is we always say, I'm not going to wrap my car around the post this time. No, you're going to drive it through somebody's front living room. Yeah. What you're going to do this time around. I mean, it's so insane in that look. But what you just said, when they've done research to say, is there a certain kind of person that becomes an addict? The one thing that stands out is the failure to learn from experience.
Yep.
That's the one thing. And we're going to see that failure to learn from experience comes from this rigidity we have inside of ourselves that things have to be a certain way for us to be okay. And instead of giving that up, we perseverate on it. We perseverate. We keep.
Well, what does that mean, perseverate?
Perseverate is we keep trying to do the same thing, thinking it is going to be different.
Oh, yeah. Try harder.
Try harder. This perseveration.
Yeah, know better. Go to school and get some information.
We don't do it. It's like we're putting a square peg in a round hole, and if it doesn't fit, we just get the sledgehammer out.
Get a bigger hammer.
That's right. It said we're clearly using the wrong hammer. I mean,
well, Bill has a wonderful phrase. It's based in sort of a old style language, but he said, "Rest satisfaction out of life if only we try harder." Rest, W-R-E-S-T, which is the root word of wrestle. We arm wrestle reality trying to make it fit, like you said.
That's exactly that. Bill is describing perseveration.
Yeah.
That is exactly what perseveration is. Exactly what it is. So it's so powerful. All right, let's go to the next slide.
There wasn't a chance of making the outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed.
Now, when he says that these are fatal, that our emotional dependencies are fatal, I want you to step back and just think about this for a minute. This is what causes somebody who's been, let's say, rejected in a relationship to come back and shoot the person that's rejected them, is because they are so emotionally dependent on that other person for how they feel, and that other person was supposed to do things according to what their expectations were. They cannot find a way to go on in their life without destroying that other person. Now, that's an extreme example, but we suffer terribly from these dependencies. They raise all kinds of problems in our lives. They are the source of our sober suffering. And when he says that we've got to these absolute dependence, absolute means that this is the way we think that things are supposed to be. It's supposed to be the way that we think they're supposed to be. And we've got to cut these things away. And when he says cut them away, it's really this idea that we've got to get to work on this. And we've got to take this work in our program very, very seriously, because we will not be able to enjoy our recovery. We will keep running into conflict with other people until we let go of these expectations.
Well, and Bill, in the introduction to the Step 4 inventory, talks about resentment. He says it destroys more alcoholics than anything else. Resentment, and that's one of the instincts that's gone awry, that creates the tension in us that we address either through medication of our addiction or some conversion of it into some form of emotional unhealthiness like depression.
Yeah.
So it's literally, he says, resentment itself kills more alcoholics than alcohol itself.
As we gain insight into these, he goes, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed. You are going to get blown away when you start to see all of the different roots that have grown from this weed into your life.
Yeah.
I mean, it wraps itself around every aspect of our life.
How does it relate to codependency, Alan?
Well, it is codependency.
Yeah.
Codependency is the term that was used to capture this experience
Yeah.
that a person had being in relationship with an alcoholic or an addict. But what you've seen and what I've seen is that anybody that hears this says this isn't just about people in recovery or dealing with an addict. This is about life. This is what happens in life.
Yeah.
And later on, I'll be sharing with you, some quotes from different psychotherapists. We have known this in psychology for a long time. And it's only been recently, I think, with my work, with Herb's work, that we're starting to integrate the wisdom of psychotherapy with the wisdom of recovery.
And the wisdom of traditional spirituality,
And I was going to say, that's the third part that's been integrated here. That's the third leg of the stool is the wisdom of spirituality. And these are they all come together at this point in terms of how do we live a good life? What does it take to show up in life in a good way that you're going to be able to have a life that flourishes? That's the title of our talk today. Because what we're talking about now is information that's going to help you flourish.
Well, and you said it at the beginning of our gathering today, and Bill, I believe, quoted at the beginning of his letter when he talked about a relationship. My definition of spiritual has really nothing to do with God or the divine. My definition of spiritual is relationship. Yeah. A relationship with reality. Now, it might be a capital R. I like to see reality with a capital R. I think it has a meditative unpacking that will take me much deeper into a connection to that reality. But it's a relationship with reality, a relationship with myself, and a relationship with others. And quite frankly, that's the way the step process is built. The first 3 steps are a relationship with power. the next 4 steps are a relationship with ourselves, and the next 3 steps, including step 10, are a relationship with other people. The steps are built specifically designed for human beings as an organic method of healing and transformation. It's like an amazing tool. That's why you and I have dedicated our lives to it.
That's right on.
Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any act or circumstance whatsoever. Then could I be free to love as Francis did. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation of life.
Now, a lot of people are quite shocked when they hear this passage. When he says, I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies on people. Well, that makes sense based on what we've been talking about so far. If I look to you to validate me, if I look to you to make me feel good, if I look to you for my self-esteem, then I am dependent on you, and you are in charge of my life, not I. Then he goes on to say, I had to also cut off my faulty emotional dependence on AA. Well, what did he mean by that? I mean, aren't we supposed to depend on AA now as a healthier dependency than the dependency we had on whatever we were addicted to, whether it's food, sex, love, whatever the thing would be? And what he is saying is that the program is, and like I said earlier, the goal of the program is to achieve emotional sobriety. Emotional sobriety is about autonomy, not dependency. Bill is promoting us to be autonomous. That's what we're talking about, our ability to take care of ourselves. It doesn't say we don't need anyone. We do. But if I have my autonomy, I'm responsible to go to you and say, hey, Herb, I need to talk. I'm going through a tough situation. And if I'm dependent, I'm waiting for Herb to figure out that I need to talk. See, that's the difference, is that I take responsibility for what I need. And also we have to cut off our faulty dependence on whatever other circumstances we're looking at. When we are able to do that, then we experience a true freedom, an emotional freedom that I mentioned that I saw in Tom when he came and spoke to us at that Drug Information Center on that Tuesday night. At that point, then I can have love, offer love, and express love appropriate to each relation of life. I don't need to love everyone in the same way, because I don't. Some people I'm more connected to than others. Some people I feel more of a kinship with than others, and that's okay. I don't need to have the expectation that everybody needs to like me, nor do I need to like everybody. So there's now a freedom, right, to be myself and to accept other people as they are.
I want to really reinforce that with the phrase that you used earlier, and that is, you have placed your center of gravity deep in yourself.
Yes. That is what emotional sobriety does.
Yeah.
It moves that emotional center of gravity deep into self. And then when Herb talked about our ability to influence our experience increases exponentially. But as soon as if my center of gravity is in you, then I've got to get really good at manipulating you to do what I want you to do for me to be all right. And if you don't do what I think you should do, then I'm screwed.
And it's not about self-centeredness in terms of putting the center of gravity deep in yourself. It's very much akin to what the flight attendant says, put your mask on first, then you can help somebody else. That's exactly what this is. That center of gravity deep in myself allows me to be a fully conscious human being, managing myself, but able to contribute to you in a conscious and compassionate way.
Right on. And see, what we can think about that is as being self-grounded. right? Think about being grounded is what we're talking about, is getting over your 2 feet and keeping your balance over your 2 feet. That's being self-grounded. You're going to see emotional sobriety has nothing to do with self-centeredness. Because if I'm going to be emotionally sober, my awareness has to be of you and of me at the same time.
The content.
That's right. It's got to be embracing. In order for me to show up in the best way I can is to be aware of you and of me at the same time. That's when the best of me shows up. But that we're getting ahead of ourselves.
It's okay to repeat ourselves.
Plainly, I could not avail myself to God's love until I was able to offer it back to Him by loving others as He would have me. And I couldn't possibly do that so long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependencies meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words absolute dependence may look like a gimmick, they were the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I am now trying to consolidate by offering love to others, regardless of the return to me.
Well, boy, he nailed it here, right? Is what he said is that he realized that my goodness, my demands, my dependency meant a demand. So now we're getting into what we're going to talk about is those should demands show up as unenforceable rules. So these are the rules that we put on how other people have to behave for us to be okay. Now we demand the possession and control of the people and conditions around it. We want people to do what we want them to do, period. There's no them in it for us. We only see them as what they can or cannot do for us. We don't experience other people as the subject of our relationship. They're an object in our relationship. And that shift really, once we get emotional sobriety, now that person becomes personal to us. They become a subject, not an object to manipulate. And now we may ask for what we want. We have preferences in our relationship, but we don't demand it. It's just, I'd like this. And if we don't get it, then we can be disappointed, and that's okay. But when we operate from that kind of a consciousness, there's room for two. There's room for the other person, not just room for our demands.
And it's interesting because most people have a sense of logic about their approach, and they really can't see beyond their glasses what you just said. Mothers should love children.
Yeah.
Fathers should teach sons. Employers should be fair.
Yeah.
And we really believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, there's some logic from a theoretical standpoint, but then you have to ask, is that your experience? And is that the general experience? And say, that's a script in my head that is completely unrealistic. It's unrealistic for me to believe the world is going to behave and should behave, because that's the right thing to do. Yeah, get over yourself and start looking around and evaluate reality as it is and determine what are the operating principles and what are the actual behaviors of people.
Now, he talks about it that it does take a release for us to get to emotional sobriety. We have to release these ideas, these concepts we have. We have to unhook people. He'll use that phrase later on. He says, when we do that, now we can start to move towards more of doing things because we want to do them, not because the other person is going to do what we want them to do. Now we move towards what the goal of emotional sobriety is this unconditional love.
I can't resist this, Alan, because at one of our physical events, we're very spontaneous, as you can see from just this event, in terms of our interaction. And at one point, midway through, he said, and he looked straight over at me on his microphone, and we've got 200 people in the room. And he said, Herb, there's only one reason to do anything. Well, I'd never heard him say it before. And so I actually didn't know what he was expecting from me as a response. So I'm going to be very honest. And I go, No, Alan, I don't know. There's only one thing. All right. And what did you say?
Well, because we want to. Because
Yeah,
we
there's
want to.
only one reason to do anything, because we really want to. And I was like a deer in headlights. It's kind of like such a startling confrontation. I had never had the thought before. Oh, because I deeply want to. Go ahead, Alan.
And well, then when we live life from that, that's that emotional center of gravity. Now, if you want to talk about what that looks like in terms of a manifestation of spirit, it is that spirit. I am doing what I want to do. And when I do what I want to do, there's no expectation about how people should respond to it. As I'm doing it, I am satisfied.
But we're not talking about being driven by our emotions or our physical needs or even our self-centeredness. That's not it at all. We're talking in the purest of senses, in a healthy sense of what I really want to do. Go ahead and comment, please.
No, you're right on. I think that's it. See, that's the difference of this, is that my reward and satisfaction comes from being who I want to be, not you having to be a certain way for me to be okay. It's I need to be a certain way to be okay.
But this is not the narcissistic, I'm the center of the universe. You want to make that distinction for us, please?
We said a minute ago, in order to have emotional sobriety, the awareness has to be of myself and others.
There you go, a context.
That's right. The narcissist has an awareness of self.
Yeah.
There's no other at all.
I am the sun and you are the planets surrounding me.
That's exactly it.
And if you collide, that's collateral damage, and I got mine.
That's exactly it. That's it. That's what narcissism looks like.
This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and His people, by means of which we avail ourselves of His love for us. It's most clear that the real current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken, and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is.
Well, I'll let you take this one, Herb, because you had some reflections on the current.
I did. I spent some time with this letter in meditation, actually, and that was one of the phrases that just captured me. And I actually didn't know what he meant on the surface of it, a healing circuit. But as I took it and read it in the context and then read the sentence itself, that healing circuit, he talks, and it's a circuit of electricity. It's a circuit of energy. And what he's talking about is when I take responsibility for myself and then I connect to you with the freedom of independence, and I bring love to you, your interpretation is going to be, well, I must be lovable. There's the energy that develops from that. I'm talking about authentic, not manipulated, not pretended. I'm talking about an authentic, I looked up the word altruism the other day in search of what does unconditional love mean. And altruism in my dictionary said, doing something for the benefit of somebody else with no possible benefit for me. Wow, that gets as close to unconditional love as I've ever seen a definition.
Yeah, that's good.
And what Bill says is, once we bring that to somebody else and they get that sense, then they're capable and released to, you use that term wonderfully, they're released to then behave similarly to somebody else. And that's the circuit that has got sort of a perpetual motion machine. I feel loved in some fashion, and I give that love, and that person feels love and they get the love. And then it all comes in a circular sense in the healing of that relationship of the community. And that's the healing circuit. And I have a reflection on that I'll have Tanya send out to the participants here so that you can spend a little bit more time with the formal reflection on that.
He mentions adult love here, and just to be aware that adult love is in contrast to what we would call immature love. Adult love is mature love, and immature love is driven by the emotional dependency we talked about. I love you because I need you, right? It's driven by my need for you. Adult love says, I love you. I want you because I love you. It's based on not on dependency, but on a desire. Another way of thinking about this is that Fromm described mature love is union with the preservation of integrity, so that we join another person, we don't get lost in them. Immature love is when we get lost in the other person. It's union with the loss of integrity is what immature love looks like. Union with the preservation of integrity, or union with the preservation of individuality, is what healthy, mature, or adult love is about.
That's a wonderful phrase, and I mean it's so succinct. It's one of those wisdom phrases that requires some quiet unpacking, perhaps even in meditation, let alone in conversation. Melody Beattie, in her book Codependent No More, talks about independent and interdependent, and I think those are the two terms that you're describing there with Fromm's quote. But then she developed a term, I think it's her term, undependent, which is the balance between independent and interdependent, meaning we're both undependent, not undependable, but undependent, meaning not connected to unhealthy ties. And I'm thinking in terms of a relationship of two islands that mutually agree to bridge. The islands are completely independent, but there's a mutual agreement for interdependency.
Yes, right on.
If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependence and its consequent demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to gain emotional sobriety.
So this is a very important algorithm here. So Bill is giving us something that we can use as a tool. And in fact, this passage, it was the basis for writing my second book with Hazelton, which is 12 Smart Things to Do When the Booze and Drugs Are Gone, which is my first book dedicated to emotional sobriety. He says, if we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we're going to find at the root of it some unhealthy dependence and its consequent demand. In the 12 and 12, and when he's talking about step 10, he goes, it's a spiritual axiom that every time I'm disturbed, no matter the cause, there's something wrong with me. And this is how you get at what's wrong with you. This is the formula that will help you unpack your disturbance and help you start to grow yourself in the direction of emotional sobriety. You know, let's say somebody doesn't do, I worked with a client one time who was celebrating 6 months. He comes home after the meeting. He's got his 6-month chip. He walks in the door. Honey, look, I've got my 6-month chip. She's on the couch watching Bones, and she looks up at him and says, so what? Well, he copped a big attitude. He got resentful. What did he expect? She'd walk in, she'd be up, you know, get her pom-poms out and start doing cheerleading and say, God, 6 months, that's fantastic. I'm so proud of you. She goes, so what? He stomps upstairs, slams the door, starts to fantasize about going out and drinking, and now is in his revenge fantasy saying, well, she says, so what? Let's see. If I'm drinking, let's see what she says then. She's not going to say, so what then, is she? He goes in all this. He just decides that that's going to hurt him more than it's going to hurt her. So he decides he's just going to withdraw from her, emotionally cut off. So he does. Well, if he unpacks this, what was his dependency? What was demand. Well, he demanded that she celebrate his 6 months, regardless of what it meant to her. And what it meant to her, this was the third time he was getting a 6-month chip. And she wasn't about to jump on the bandwagon with him. She was staying back, understandably being cautious and not wanting to set herself up. But in his narcissism, what did he want? She had to do it the way that he wanted her to do it. What was his dependence? Well, the value of his sobriety depended on how she felt about it. He was going to throw his sobriety out the window because she didn't celebrate his 6-month chip with him. So that was his unhealthy dependence, is that his recovery was too much based on how she would feel about it, which is probably what's caused him to get the third time to get a 6-month chip, right? This is probably his emotional dependency. And Herb and I feel very strongly about this. A lot of people say you can't work on this stuff until you're well into your recovery. I think that that's wrong. I think the quicker people get on top of this stuff, the more stable the recovery is going to be. And that was missing from him. He wasn't doing this because he was committed to himself. He was doing this to manipulate her and to get her to feel good about him because, quite frankly, the marriage was in big trouble. So this idea that Bill gave us is so important, because once we realize it, we can start to surrender these hobbling demands. When I surrender them, then I'm set free to live in love. That's when I'm able to gain emotional sobriety.
I actually begin, and I have started this about 5 years ago, but only 5 years ago, I start working with individuals and with my workshop, introducing them to that axiom that you just talked about. It's a spiritual axiom. Whenever I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me. And even though people don't believe it, I try to put it in a framework where they'll accept it because it's my experience. And then I introduce them to step 10 for that very reason. Don't wait until you get to step 10 to start practicing step 10, because step 10 will keep the current wreckage at a minimum.
Right. That's very well said. That's exactly right.
Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I've been given a quiet place in bright sunshine.
Okay, let me stop sharing and turn this back over to you, Herb.
We could start any questions that you might have, some perhaps based on what either of us have shared so far. If you have a question or a comment about it, raise your hand through the participant icon, and we'll be able to respond to you in the order of your hand raised.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you both. I have aging parents, and that's completely unacceptable to me. I cannot tell you. It's just not working for me at all. And it's interesting to think about how I am doing this.
Yes.
Like crazy. And I'm doing that in a lot of other areas of my life. And then I keep having distress. And I'm like, yeah. I get it. So the greatest gift that I'm feeling at this moment is going in flow with the aging process.
Yes.
And that's a big one for me. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Yeah, I hear people say, gosh, I don't want to get old. And I go, yeah, I really do, because I don't like the alternative.
That's my thought exactly. For me, aging, hey, I'm cool with it. I just want to be here. And I want
That's
to be
it. As long as I have my ability to interact with you, that'll be great. Yeah, thanks so much.
I just wanted to comment on the thing I heard, the two types of motivation. I could relate to, I guess, the deficit motivation, I think it was, because I share that a lot, that I feel like my pain is what motivated me. And I wasn't going to let anything get in the way of recovery, even though I didn't know what recovery was at the time. But I do share that a lot. And And then the other comment on the spiritual axiom, that is actually the thing that when I heard someone say that, I knew it was me. I knew there was something wrong with me, and that's basically what began my whole journey. And the figuring out what that really means has evolved over some years now. And I think really what sums it up is almost what you said. There's another guy that has a lot of experience and a lot of time, and he answers most questions with God is or God isn't. And that's really what the spiritual axiom is all about. And it took me a while to really figure that out. But when we're that disturbed and reality is what is like disturbing us, we're just not God conscious in that moment. And that took some time to figure that out, you know, because when your ego hears that, you're basically offended.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, not so much anymore because I can be in acceptance and I don't use the word should. And I stop myself and I reframe sentences, and to the best of my ability, I basically don't use that word, you know, and that's all because of this.
Yeah.
And that's a tribute to you really, and Dr. Berger.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a great word. And we might be talking about it later on also, but I wanted to emphasize it, reframing. We have a story. We need to reframe the story based on now our current experience and consciousness. And the reframing is a lifelong process, because we're constantly, I love the dimmer switch analogy. The dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time and there's more light. Now, next week, there'll be more light than there is today. So I'll be able to see more about what I was not able to see more today. That's not a negative judgment. That's just a reality. And it brings hope into it. One of the things that Sharon mentioned earlier brought to mind a phrase that Father Richard Rohr taught. He's got so much wisdom. And he says, what we do any one place, we do every place. That is confrontation. Oh my God. If I do this with aging, underneath it, what is the operating principle? I do that every place. If I'm nasty to this person, oh my, maybe that's a form of nastiness I have in my relationships with people generally. So it's not always 100%, but it's 100% applicable to challenge ourselves in terms of that kind of consciousness confrontation.
So we've been talking about emotional sobriety this morning, and in psychological terms. So I'm a little confused now how the spiritual journey dovetails with the psychological journey.
Right.
It's a little, you know, it seems as if there are two paths rather than this one merging.
Yeah. Well, boy, you're so engaged that you could have been announcing the next part. That's a perfect segue to this next part. Go ahead, Alan.
So I was going to say, Herb and I have talked a lot about this. I think that there's a misnomer when we start fragmenting things.
Yes.
The mind is the body is the mind. The spirit is psychological, psychology is spiritual.
Yeah.
I mean, if it might be better served if we don't separate it and we think of it more as an integration, right? Is we're just talking about different parts when we're talking about it. But I'm not going to say more because Herb is going to let you know about all this.
But it is a perfect setup for this next piece. Bill said it so beautifully. He said, there are no disciplines and rules in Alcoholics Anonymous or in any 12-step program. There are no discipline or rules or requirements. He said there's only two disciplines in reality. There's only two disciplines. One is God and the other is alcohol. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. It's a full, and that's the real point that Dr. Berger just made. Integration is the key word. Spiritual doesn't mean non-human. Spiritual just means relationship. Are we human beings seeking a spiritual experience, or are we spiritual beings seeking a human experience? You've heard it in the rooms. It's cute. It's actually philosophical, and it's actually quite a challenging reflection. And I spent some time with it. We'll be looking at it as we go through this next piece. Are we human beings seeking a spiritual experience, or spiritual beings seeking a human experience? And you know what my conclusion was? Yes, they're not different. They're just two sides of a coin. If you looked at one side of a coin, you'd see heads. If you looked at the other side of the coin, you'd see tails. It's only one coin, though. And this life we have that we call human is a journey of relationship, a relationship with reality, a relationship with ourselves, and a relationship with other people. But it's only one journey, and it's only one reality. And there's more. Believe me, there's more. Thank you.
Hi, yes, thank you. Herb and Dr. Berger, thank you so much. This is excellent. I can't write fast enough.
Right. Good thing it's recorded.
What's that?
Good thing it's recorded.
Yes, right. I love the analogy, Herb, of the arm, the other thing I just, I have to comment on the emotional the emotional immaturity piece, which is something that, like, as of late, I've really been aware of, sort of stuck in us, thinking of myself as at a different time. And, how can I catch up to my 40-something-year-old self?
Yes.
There's so many, things that you touched on, but, that and the idea of fantasy. I love that you brought that up, Dr. Berger, because I feel like we don't really talk about that ever. Nobody ever talks about this fantasy thinking, and how, like, even when you were discussing adult love versus immature love, another thing that I still think in all these areas, I'm still stuck in a certain time of my life, and haven't caught up, and the dependence, being dependent, this emotional dependency, and everything having to be just right, so we can be okay, depending on everybody else's, validation, or their, or how their reaction, like the guy coming home with the chip, looking for that validation, and, and trying to figure out who we are. I mean, all of this is just like, it's all just, it's awesome, especially because these are all issues that I'm working on and trying to deal with, and sort of trying to, figure out how to, like I said, be who I want to be, stop caring about, the outside people, but, and also catching up to who I am and owning that and being okay, like feeling okay.
This question you're asking is a question that has such depth. We'll be at this for a long time, addressing it from different perspectives. So welcome to the family.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't even know if I can come up with this question right. Early in my recovery, I really suffered from, walking away from family and friends who lived in addiction. And so I'm just, a lot of the stuff you talked about this morning made me think, what does it have to change? What has to change in me so that I can still love and be present to my family who
Wonderful
still lives in addiction?
Wonderful question. And I'm sure there's not a single answer, and I'll try first, and then Dr. Berger can address it from a professional psychological standpoint. But from a personal and a spiritual standpoint, two things happened. Number one, I did the steps out of the big book more than once, with more than one step guide over about a 10-year period. And I was given a consciousness that allowed me to release everybody. And when I looked up the term forgiveness in a dictionary, it says a decision to release them. And at that time, I came across another clinical psychologist Fred Luskin, Luskin, who has written a book, Pure Psychology, on forgiveness, and it's called Forgive for Good. And he did his doctoral dissertation on forgiveness back in 30 years ago, and then put it into a book form for the rest of us non-clinical people. He and I did a panel back then when I had just done the work of the steps and experienced forgiveness. So I read his book and found it totally compatible with that effort. And after we did the panel, I said to him, I said, you know, the process that you describe psychologically and the process that I've experienced through the 12 steps in spirituality are identical. The process and the dynamics are identical. The vocabulary is different, but the process is identical. And he said, yes, that's exactly right. However, you spiritual and 12-step people have a big advantage. And I said, what's that? He said, you got God. You've got a power other than yourself. It's an X plus factor that puts it on steroids. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there is a process in the 12 steps that will bring you to a freedom of perspective with regard to your relationships and your ability to tolerate their decisions and consequences in their lives. If you have a problem with that still, Al-Anon is a terrific place to deal with relationships from an addiction standpoint. And then some possible therapy might be of some benefit to deal with that codependency so that you can live free of your addiction. You can live free of your intolerance. You can live free, not be influenced by and remain safe in your relationship with people if you choose to have it. Dr. Berger?
Well, it's a very important question, and to unpack it and to give it service would take some time. I'll just say this as a comment, is when you can stay connected to someone and add more self, then you won't have to emotionally cut yourself off.
You want to unpack that just a little bit, add more self, because that's one of your favorite
is to let go of your expectations that they have to be different or that you have to do something to help them at the time.
Yeah.
So when you add more self, and this is the opposite of what we're taught in the program, we're taught to subtract self, which is, I think, the wrong direction in this. I know what we're talking about is adding a wiser self. We're not talking about the narcissistic self here.
Right.
So that's the distinction. And I think that's the warnings come in the program about ego and self and all that. But what we're talking about here is staying connected and adding more self, is being able to love them where they're at, being able to be concerned about them, being able to hope the best for them and let go of any expectations that they're supposed to be different than they are.
And offering your wisdom if in fact you're asked for it, and staying safe so that you're not going to be impacted by their behavior.
That's right. Yeah, you don't jump in a car if they're drinking and driving, and you know, and that, I mean, you protect yourself in that way physically, but that's what it looks like. Is then you don't need to run away. You don't need to cut yourself off, because you're right. That's the immaturity in you. You know, when you're running away like that, all that's saying is you don't know how to take better care of yourself. That's all.
Yeah.
But we used to say, you know, if they're toxic, get out of the relationship. And there was even that book by Susan Forward about toxic people and cut toxic people out of your life. Well, our job is not to cut toxic people out of our life. Our job is to not let their toxicity overly influence us. And that's what emotional
that's harder than it sounds, of course.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So it's a wonderful question. Thanks for asking it. And as we go forward today, but also with the cycle of programs and topics that Dr. Berger and I review, there will be more expansion of our knowledge and experience that will help you and others with answering that question.
This line about, let's see, I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people.
Yes.
And, we're talking about integration.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering about the term cutting off dependencies and how do we do that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's excellent. Thank you for listening and asking that question. And the root word underneath the word decision is to cut off. Decision means if you're going to turn right, you can't turn left. If you're going to eat cake, you're not going to lose weight. A decision. And step 2, although it doesn't say it in the book, it implies it. Step 2 is a decision, God or no God. And step 3 is clearly a decision to turn in alignment to that relationship with that power other than ourselves. And I do believe that's how we cut it off. That is, we cut the strings that are the puppet strings between us and people and us and circumstances. And we do that in a process. That's not an event. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm just going to get my scissors and cut those. No, it took me 10 years and 3 journeys through the steps to finally get some sense of independence and more self, as Dr. Berger said. You see, we have free will, but where is it free? That's really the question. Bill says in step 1, we're not free with regard to our addiction. We have no power. But interestingly enough, and the best kept secret in the 12-step rooms, we're not free with regard to managing our own lives. He calls it unmanageability, but that's not because of the addiction. That's because of our humanity. And I'm going to talk about that now. So it's a perfect segue along with the other questions that we have. You see, when you're engaged in what we do, you organically progress with us as we've thought through what we want to try to share with you today. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to put this up if it works. Let's see if it does. And I'm going to probably go into the background. And then that's, of course, my name, but we don't need to stay there. I'm going to talk not only about emotional sobriety, I'm going to talk about spiritual sobriety. I'm so glad that that term came up today in the connection. And I do believe, again, it's a coin in their hand and glove. The human being is both emotional because of our limbic system and spiritual in the sense of the broad relationship, the broad definition of relationship. But ask yourself these questions. Here you are today, showing up today. Ask yourself, is your life serial suffering? Now, I'm not talking about your addiction. If in fact you're still in your addiction or having some chronic relapse, regular cyclical relapse problems, of course your life is suffering. But I'm assuming that you have some period of abstinence or have at least had some experience with abstinence. And so today I'm asking you, not about that, is do you think your life can change? Do you think it can change from where you're at today? Well, I mean, it's not a trick question, and I'm preaching to the choir, because if you're here today, obviously you think that if you can get some information or you can get some suggestions for tools, that in fact your life will change. Most of us are living lives like this, especially in our addiction. I saw this cartoon in a New Yorker magazine probably 40 years ago, and it stayed with me. And when I began to try to develop communication of my experience, this is only one slide of a 2-slide set. I'll show you the other slide in a minute. But most of us feel like we're in jail, certainly if we're in our addiction. But Bill calls it bondage of self also. That's not a throwaway line, bondage of self. That's that unmanageability. So ask yourself these questions today. And we've done a lot of talking. You've asked some questions, which means that you're engaged with us on a conscious level. But where is your life not working today? I mean, you were invited to come here today somehow by the flyer or the social media or the email or a friend. Well, why did you respond when hundreds of people didn't respond? There's many reasons for that, but you responded because someplace in you, there's something that needs to be changed. Look over your shoulder. How effective have your efforts been so far? Do you really want to change? That's a huge question. It might be quite confrontational. Do you really want to change, or do you just want to feel better with magic fairy dust? I mean, Disney's had an incredible unhealthy influence in our culture because we think there's some kind of a magic formula, and there isn't. It's when we behave differently that we change, as I mentioned earlier on. But then specifically, what would you like to change? My most favorite question that came to me probably about 20 years ago in my meditation, and I use it regularly, is what is the invitation? Every morning at someplace in my meditation practice, and I have a consistent daily meditation, I ask the question today, what is my invitation today? And I listen. We've heard in the rooms and we've read in literature the wee small voice, that phrase, the wee small voice. Well, that's an incorrect translation of the Aramaic. I don't read Aramaic, but I read translations of and commentaries on some things. And I found out just about 3 or 4 years ago that that's not an accurate translation. It's not wee small voice, it's tiny whispering sound. Now that may seem like almost the same thing, but it's really different because there's no words. There's just a vibration, tiny whispering sound. That's the benefit of silence. That's the benefit of sitting quietly and thinking and listening. Listening to what? Listening to the vibration, listening to the sound, listening to our instincts, listening to our thoughts, listening to our awareness, listening to our feelings as a medium of the message. For me, that's the heart of meditation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you can answer those questions even today for yourself as we're asking them, especially right now. What is the single source of your suffering? Notice I didn't ask you what your suffering was. What's the source of your suffering? And you may not know. I did not know, and I did not know that I did not know. I was clueless for a long time. Fortunately, and some people talked about addiction and the stopping of emotional and mature growth, and that's absolutely true. From my standpoint, we're in a state of almost suspended animation once we begin being hijacked by our addiction. Fortunately, though, it's my experience that once you get sober, it's not a year for year transformation. In other words, if I was an addict for 10 years, I need to be recovered for 10 years. No, it's not proportional. Depending on the level of work and the level of the teaching and the level of the activity that you have, you'll have a very different experience. But in a matter of 10 years, I was able to recoup 30 or 40. So it's a disproportionate recovery because it's not about my particular effort. It's about my willingness and action. And I believe firmly in the underlying assumption that there is a power other than myself. I don't know what it is. I just know that it is. And I know that now because I acted as if it's true. And when I did that and 10 years later look back over my shoulder, I can see the results. It's spiritual math. Regular math is 1 + 1 = 2. Spiritual math is 1 + 1 = 5. And what I mean by that is when I look at the outcome of my effort, it's disproportionate to the contribution of my effort. It's much larger outcome as I've judged it. This is the story that I have. I don't know whether my story's true, but it's the one I'm applying and it works for me. I was introduced to a man who said, Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. This was at 5 years of sobriety. You have a whole bunch. You have a graduate education in philosophy, in psychology, and in theology, 3 different graduate programs. And now you're in AA 4 or 5 years. You have a lot of information, but you haven't changed. You haven't changed at the radical personal behavioral level. It was life-changing image that he gave me. And he quoted Einstein: the consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. And he asked me to have an attitude of openness in my mind and openness in my heart, and be willing to be changed. Be willing to be taken to a place that you don't even know exists. I created a set-aside prayer for myself that has changed over time. My current version is, Holy Spirit, release me from up till now and detach me from after now, and allow me to be fully present in the now. A power other than ourself that I give different names to. Alan mentioned that my favorite term is mystery. I don't know what it is, but I believe and act as if it is. Still today, I don't have any certitude and I have no special feeling about it. But I made that decision, a cold faith decision in step 2. Very thin, very dark, very empty, very insubstantial. God is. Whatever that is, reality is, power is. And in step 3, I made a decision to be in alignment with that to the best of my ability to perceive it. And my life's journey is to stay conscious and to become more conscious so that I'm perceiving more accurately, more effectively over time. So Maslow, and you heard Dr. Berger refer to it, has a diagram and a model for the hierarchy of human needs, and I've adopted it, dropped his name from it because I've used my terms for it, but it gives me an approach to human development, an organic process. Obviously, biology is really important. Question for you, and it's the question I've been using to challenge people for at least 10, maybe 20 years. And it's especially true today with the pandemic and the technology that we have and the isolation that we're submitted to. Are you getting enough sleep? What's enough, Herb? 7.5 to 9 hours consistent daily. It's not negotiable. Now, it may be that you're an exception, probably not, but it may be that you are an exception. I have no opinion about that. But the general population needs 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep a night consistently. And if you don't get that, you will be compensating with unhealthy behavior. Resentment that turns into rage, fear that turns into anxiety and phobias, shame that turns into some form of selfish sexuality or other unhealthy behavior. This is how we operate as human beings. If you don't get 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep, and you think that it might be worth experimenting with, try it for 5 days in a row. Literally make a commitment, do whatever you need to do to get 5 days in a row and see how you feel on the other side of it. Of course, then there's the emotional awareness and all that comes with that, and the social relationships are particularly challenged today, and we need to be creative about it. Stay within the guidelines, of course, but challenge it and be creative about it. I meet with my daughters probably once every 2 or 3 weeks, independently or together, because I trust their judgment. I don't meet with people that I can't trust their judgment of. I'm 80 years old. I'm very healthy, but I'm a target demographic. It's about using common sense. And then Alan talked generously about some of the terms of accelerated human development, self-actualization. I believe that's developing a conscience. When we are disturbed, we're taking responsibility, something's wrong with us. If in fact we're in a 12-step program, we're committed to a step 11 consciousness practice, at least theoretically in the big book. Bill suggests in the morning we meditate for guidance, and in the evening we do meditation as an inventory to see how we did during the day. Challenge yourself. Do you believe meditation is important? Do you believe that you need a power other than yourself? And then the final question is, do you do daily meditation? Because if you don't do it, you don't believe it. I don't care what you think or feel or say. Your feet tell you the truth. Somebody mentioned something about behavior in our discussions in the Q&A. I heard a great phrase the other day in a meeting. There's so much wisdom said, pithy, succinct wisdom from people's experience. And it says, live where your feet are. Oh my God. That's like be here now. Ram Dass in 1960, that was his book, Be Here Now. Or Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. Everybody, all the spiritual teachers talk about living in the present moment. Be where your feet are is one of those wisdom sayings encouraging us to be present to our current circumstances. And then self-transcendence, that ultimate turning from our self-centeredness to helping other people. Those are $100 words: self-actualization, self-realization, self-transcendence. But it's all about that turning that is asked for, invited for, suggested in the 12 steps. Committed to in step 3, turning our will in our life over to the care. That's an oft overlooked word. To the care of reality, to the care of a power other than ourselves. We're not turning our will in our life over to God. We're not turning our will in our life in an act of surrender. That's passivity. That's not the intent at all. It's a ferocious act of my will for me to turn, to be in alignment with reality. And what I mean by that is it requires me to do steps 4 through 9. In order to understand what reality is. Reality isn't what I thought it was. With all that level of education and application and even therapy, I didn't know that I didn't know that I was delusional. I thought I was a Renaissance man. As it turns out, when I finished with the step work, I wasn't a Renaissance man, I was a Neanderthal. Using all of that information to beat you into submission so that I get my way. Am I a human being seeking a spiritual experience? Or am I a spiritual being seeking a human experience? You heard me ask that question earlier. My answer is yes. Two sides of the same coin. I'm very familiar with the Russian dolls. I use that metaphor a lot in terms of the step 4 through 9 process. They're called nesting dolls because inside each one is a replica of it. And you just saw, if you were paying attention to the slide, the term my story come up. This is my story that's developed from my genetics. I'm white, you might have noticed that. I'm bald, you can't avoid noticing that, all right? I'm male, all right? None of that's my fault. It's a result of genetics. My father, his father, his father, 5 generations, and we're all alcoholics. So you see, that's genetics. It was passed on. 80% of addiction, as I understand it from reading the science, 80% is genetic. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to unpack it. So we need to see that our family of origin has a contribution to our dysfunction. There's so much more literature now on PTSD coming out of families that have abandonment, have death, have disability, have mental illness, not just addiction, not just the trauma of physical abuse, but the trauma of some form of earthquake, figuratively speaking, that's happened from a variety of human circumstances. We have lots of emotional reactions. Bill talks about instincts gone awry, and I relate it to the biology of fight, flight, and freeze. These are survival mechanisms in us: fight, flight, freeze. They're survival mechanisms that get translated into our emotions of resentment and fear and shame and guilt and dishonesty. We need to be educated, but some of us have information that comes from our culture or misinformation that comes from ignorant people. But these are teachers in our lives, and we don't know that we don't know, and we don't know that they don't know, and we take it on. And if our life suffers, we need to unpack all of this. Bill calls it the deflation of the ego at depth, steps 4 through 9, those purposes. The deflation of the ego, the removing in us of the obstacles in us to the power that is in us. Identifying, and Dr. Berger said it, we need to name it. Pay attention to the steps. All of the even steps are naming steps. All of the odd steps are decision and action steps. It's an insight that came to me about 25 years ago in my third journey through the steps. All of the even steps are naming steps. Name God in step 2. Name obstacles in step 4. Name the defects that come from those obstacles in step 6, and name how they impact others in step 8, and continue naming them in step 10, and name the principles that are basic to reality in step 12. And then all of the odd steps, and I won't go through them, are decisions and actions. It's exactly how we're built. We have a mind that thinks, naming, and we have a will, a free will that makes decisions to take actions. The question is, where are we not free? Bill says we're not free because we're self-centered. You can read it on page 62 in the big book. Selfishness, self-centeredness is the root of our trouble. And then in the conclusion of that second paragraph, he says, we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. Oh my. I'm powerless. That's the nature of addiction. Excuse me, that's the nature of unmanageability. That's the nature of unmanageability, nothing to do with addiction. It has everything to do with my human nature. Instincts gone awry. My fight instinct turns into resentment. My flight instinct turns into fear. My dishonesty instinct, my freeze instinct, my camouflage instinct turns into dishonesty and secrets and sex and guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are not in the big book. The rest of the words are. But the guilt and shame are not there, but they would be today if he were writing today. We have lots more psychological sophistication. But notice that the red foundation is the root. That's the nature of humanity. That's the nature of all human beings. We're self-centered. It's a survival mechanism. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing. We make decisions based on self. Now, as we mature, if we mature, we make those decisions for self in a broader context of other people. But meanwhile, we come to a 12-step program, or we come to religion, or we come to therapy, or we come to some type of self-help program because we're suffering. And the truth is, there's the other cartoon. There's the other slide. There's no walls. There's no ceiling. There's no floor. There's just pitiful Herbie holding bars in front of his face, thinking he's in prison. But I'm not in prison. All I have to do is drop the bars, but I don't know I'm holding the bars. I don't know the bars that are things that I created as survival mechanisms. And after I finish the 9th step, I begin to realize all of that. And I enter the world of the spirit, Bill says in step 10. And my body is freed from its cyclical relapsing because my mind is freed from its vulnerability to the obsession. I do spend 4 months with my groups on the first step. I have an allergy, the Dr. Silkworth says, the opinion that produces a phenomenon of craving. Once I take a drink, the trigger's been pulled, the biochemical reaction happens, I have an allergy, and I will drink more than I intended. Once I stop and intend to stop and have stopped for 30 days or 30 months, the obsession returns and I pick it up again, and I'm powerless to prevent that. There's nothing that I can do. It's traumatic, an experience of no choice and powerlessness, as I had experienced the step process. But the most traumatic was the realization that 10 years sober, 10 years of the gift of abstinence, that my life was still as unmanageable as it was prior to my coming into a program and getting free from alcohol. Unmanageability was the problem. I was recovered from my addiction, but I am not cured from my unmanageability. And that's what Bill said. Again, the best kept secret in the room. And this is the key to emotional sobriety. That's the whole point of this, is not a teaching on the steps or the step process, but a context for really understanding emotional sobriety. I'm not cured of my unmanageability. Ask yourself, do I have a sense of well-being? Maybe you do and you want more, or maybe you don't and that's why you're here. Is your life one of contentment? Can you really say that your life flourishes? I've been able to say my life flourishes for 32 years, progressively getting better. But in 1988, when I finished this step work, I had a major transformation called a spiritual awakening. Well, what is that? It's a turning from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. Notice, it's a turning, it's an awakening. A turning that was committed to in step 3, that was implemented by doing steps 4 through 9, and I began to experience as I lived this way of life, Bill calls it. Step 10, continuing to remove the obstacles in me with spot check inventory. Step 11, sitting in the presence of the presence in the morning for guidance. Sitting in relationship with the other with a capital O. And then allowing myself throughout the day to have an attitude of how can I help others? Others with a small o. I have been turned from my self-centeredness. And actually mine was psychological, pathological. I'm a recovering narcissist at the same time. When I was in my step work and dealing in therapy with Dr. Berger, I was talking about some aspects of my behavior, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And he went up to his DSM and took a page out and had a photocopy of it and gave it to me, and with the 9 characteristics of narcissism. He said, there's only one thing missing from the DSM. He says, it's your picture. Yeah, he's a Marine. He takes no prisoners, but he does help the wounded. The goals of the 12-step process is that turning that I talked about. From in the world of self, steps 1 through 9. This is a process of turning. This is the rite of passage into adulthood, to use Bill's terms from 6 and 7. We turn and we enter into the world of spirit. Now, you could use the term the world of adulthood, the world of the true self, the world of self-consciousness, the world of optimal living, the world of the human spirit. You don't need to think in terms of God and spirit in the divine sense or in the traditional sense or in the sacred sense. I choose to. The big book assumption is God as we understand it. It might have been better phrased to say God as we don't understand it. I don't pretend to understand it. Any God that I could understand would not be big enough. as Groucho Marx said back in the 50s, a comedian, one of the first comedians on television, when he was talking about a country club. Any country club that would allow him to be a member, he wouldn't want to be a member of. It's a joke. Any God that I could understand is too small. I tell people all the time, upgrade your God, trade in your God. We have a concept of power that's too limited. And what I found from my tradition, I studied to be a Catholic priest, as I mentioned to you. I found that my tradition and my vocabulary were the very obstacles to my relationship. The God of my understanding up until age 54, 10 years sober, was the very impediment to my relationship with the mystery. It's an amazing experience when the curtain parts. Steps 10 through 12, Bill calls our way of living. Optimal recovery is freedom from the addiction, but optimal living is freedom from unmanageability, a guarantee of happiness. I did quite a bit of work over the last 5 years on the concept of happiness. You may or may not know that Harvard has a department, like an entire department of happiness. It comes out of the conversion of psychology in the late 90s to positive psychology. And they started focusing on normal psychology, what creates healing and healthy behavior rather than focusing on abnormal behavior. And the conclusion of the 10 books that I read that were statistically significant studies, and then books on those studies and their outcomes, the conclusion was anybody who wants to be happy, that's their goal, will never be happy. Wow. If that's your goal, your primary goal, you'll never be happy, because they said happiness is not a product, it's a byproduct. It's a byproduct of my relationship to reality, a concept, a meaning bigger than myself, and a relationship of contribution to the humanity around me. Wow, is that reminiscent of steps 11 and 12, a relationship with a power other than myself, and step 12, a relationship in service of helping other people? You know, it goes back to the Judaic principle. Jesus asked the Pharisee, the lawyers of the time, what's the primary operating rules here? And the Pharisee said, love God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your might, and love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, yeah, you got that one right. And I bring a New Testament. This was the Old Testament. This was the Old Witness. These were the principles of the Judaic tradition. I bring a New Testament. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul is identical. Love your neighbor as God loves you. A little bit different slant. Same kind of concept. The Buddhists have two operating principles. It's not a religion, as I understand it. I'm a dilettante in the area of Buddhism. I read and I study and I talk to people about it. I don't practice it. They call it a way of life. It's not a religion because they don't believe in God. They don't believe in a unifying or separate God as the normal religions do. They believe in the higher self, and that's the whole purpose of their meditation practice, their contemplation practice, to improve their consciousness, to in fact connect to the true self rather than living out of that false self that Dr. Berger talked about. And the two words they use are wisdom and compassion. No, you get underneath those words, wisdom is a relationship with reality, a relationship with the meaning broader than ourselves. And compassion means helping other people, being connected to and contributing to humanity around me. You see, everybody has the same dynamic, that we just have different vocabulary. This is emotional and spiritual sobriety, what we're talking about here. A way of living, Bill calls it. Yeah, he uses that term 20 different times to refer to steps 10, 11, and 12. Step 10, to clear the channel. Step 11, to fill the channel. Step 12, to empty the channel. Think in terms of the prayer of St. Francis, the prayer that Bill incorporates into step 11 in the 12 and 12 as a meditation practice. I'll talk about that in a minute. A channel. I'm a channel. I'm a conduit. My favorite image of my role as sponsor or teacher or spiritual director is I'm a lantern. I'm not the light. The lantern reflects the light, transmits the light. I'm a lantern that stands by the side of the path that shines the light of my experience on the path so other people can walk that path in the light of my experience to have their own experience. I'm not attached to them having an experience. I don't try to project into them my experience. I try to light the path so that they can walk the path with elegance and have their own experience of transformation, of awakening. That's emotional sobriety. Sobriety, as we've talked about, is a sense of without excess. It's based on our structure. And we've talked about this both before my conversation with you now with Dr. Berger and now especially. The steps are built specifically for us as human beings. What are we as human beings? We have this brain stem at the top of our shoulders, at the bottom of our neck, a brain stem, that first brain that was developed, that is the biological, physical brain. And it tells us when to eat and when to drink and when to mate. That's the survival instinct of the lizard. But millions of years later, we developed the limbic system, those emotions that come from those survival instincts of fight, flight, and freeze, resentment and fear, and dishonesty. Fight, flight, freeze, freeze, camouflage. It's a wonderful model to understand the unpacking of step 4, for instance. But we were made human by the development millions of years later of our cortex to know and to decide. Look at how step 11 is built. Praying for the knowledge of your will for me and the power to carry it out. Because Bill knew that to know better is not to do better. And that we're powerless actually to know better, but even knowing better, we're powerless to do better. And therefore we need to pray for that. Not praying to change God, because at least my concept of God, God doesn't change. God can't come, God can't go. God can't be present, God can't be absent. God can't reward, God can't punish. I mean, those are just my concepts. And again, I spend a month with my group on the step 2 and another month on step 3. They're very profound concepts. In fact, Bill says step 2 is the cornerstone of a spiritual structure through which we'll walk to a new freedom. And step 3 is the keystone in that spiritual arch. Critical concepts. What is your concept of power other than yourself? What is your understanding of step 3? Turning your will and your life over to the care. Critical state. Critical words. Over to the care. It's kind of like the GPS. It's my car, I own it. I know how to drive it, I have the keys. The tank is filled with gas, I have insurance, and I know how to drive my car. I know where I want to go, I just don't know how to get there. So I put the address in the GPS and then I listen. You see, that's the point of meditation, is to listen and get guidance. GPS, God positioning system. Step 10, God positioning system. It's like a GPS. I listen to the feelings that I have. The problem is that we fall asleep. One of the Russian philosophers said, all human beings are asleep, dreaming that they are awake. It's brilliant. kind of like the Einstein quote. All human beings are asleep, dreaming that they are awake. That's why Bill's codification of the outcome of the 12 steps in the 12th step itself is brilliant. He's talking about waking up, having had a spiritual awakening. Oh, that must mean I was asleep. And that was clearly the truth in 1988, working the steps for the very first time, 4 years sober. That's when I had that insight that I'm not a Renaissance man, I'm a Neanderthal. And I continued to work the steps over the next 12 years with different people, 3 different times, 3 different people, with 3 different levels of awakening. A story for a different day. But I discovered that my beliefs are lenses through which I look. I have a pair of glasses on. They're grounded to be accurate in terms of the transmission of what I'm seeing. But if in fact they had not been ground properly, I wouldn't see properly. One of the major books here in the West Coast is A New Pair of Glasses by Chuck C. It really captures the image. I need a new pair of glasses, and I get that new lenses from doing steps 4 through 9, and I keep refining those lenses by doing steps 10, 11, and 12. Otherwise, my sense of reality is distorted. And when my sense of reality is distorted, what I perceive disturbs me. If I think it, quote, should be something other than it is. We talked about that, and we'll talk about it more. And the way it reveals itself, Bill has this magical paragraph that's kind of embedded and hidden in chapter 4 on page 52. I call it the bedevilment paragraph. It's the second paragraph that behaviorally describes unmanageability. The magic was to convert the statements into a personal statement in the present tense. I am having trouble with personal relationships. See if you can identify with this inventory. This is a litmus test of your spiritual condition. Yeah, right here, sitting right here as we're talking. If you can personalize this in the present tense, it'll be interesting to see what your reaction is if you have an open mind and an open heart and willing to hear it, willing to listen to it, willing to apply it. I am having trouble with personal relations. Mother and father, partner, siblings, children, teachers, sponsors, sponsees, employers, employees. Are you having trouble with personal relations? I can't control my emotional natures. I am a prey to misery and depression. I can't make a living. I took it into meditation because I had a wonderful job and a career, and they paid me a decent amount of money at the time. But the tiny whispering sound in me said, Herb, you can't make a living that satisfies you. You see, we get really creative when we open our heart and our mind, and the spirit speaks the truth. It breathes the inspiration and intuition into us. The word spirit comes from the Greek spiros, meaning breath. The breath of God in me when I get quiet and listen to the tiny whispering sound. I can't make a living that satisfies me. And the voice went on, because you are a deep black hole, a bottomless pit, and there's not enough pleasure or money or adulation or confirmation for you, is there, Herb? I have a feeling of uselessness. I'm 10 years sober when I'm having this realization. Some of it applies and some of it doesn't apply so much. I am full of fear, not so much. I am unhappy, not so much. I can't seem to be of real help to other people. And I challenge it. Well, wait, I studied to be a missionary priest. Then I studied to be a psychologist. Then I studied the self-help to become a really good employee and a better manager of people. And now I'm in AA sponsoring people. How does that apply to me? And the tiny whispering sound, after I got quiet and really opened my heart, said, Herb, you don't really want to help people. You want the reputation of helping people. And my narcissism was revealed to me one more time. when we get quiet and we open our mind and we open our heart and we ask the Spirit to have spiritual intervention to actually bring the spiritual crowbar and open our mind and open our heart, and we mean it, or at least we're willing to mean it, even if we really don't mean it, the Spirit will have its way with us. That's my experience. So what's emotional sobriety? And we've talked about balance. That's the key word here. And we've taken a look at step 10 superficially today, but enough of an outline that will give you a sense of its power as a tool. Those were the 4 things that we saw in step 4. A moral inventory, step 4. Step 10 says it's a personal inventory. Now, thank God for the 12 and 12, because in that commentary, Bill clarifies the use of the 10th step. The 10th step is not a tool to be used at night. The 10th step is not a tool to be used in writing. Well, I don't have any preference. I don't really have a concern about somebody who wants to do a 10th step at night or do a 10th step in writing. But it's just not the purpose of it. I want to help you understand what the purpose of step 10 is. And step 10 in the 12 and 12, Bill says, is a spot check inventory. Oh, on the spot, he says, it's a spiritual axiom. Whenever I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me. Oh, if I'm disturbed, I need to own it. There's something wrong with my perception and my interpretation and my reaction. What's up with that? What's my motive? What's my belief that's been trampled on? Because if I'm disturbed, it's my problem, nobody else's problem. And when I'm aware that I'm disturbed, Bill says we take the action. So the big book's formula is fabulous as long as we're really understanding how to use it. It's kind of like our cell phone. We carry it as a tool of communication wherever we are. It's an effective form of communication, unless in fact we allow it to dominate us. And then again, we have another kind of addiction or another kind of dependency. I manage my cell phone. It doesn't manage me. When I go to a meeting, I leave my cell phone in the car. When I'm at home, there are times of the day I turn my phone off, my cell phone. I turn off my home phone in the morning because my mornings are sacred time for me. I manage my environment. I manage my technology. It doesn't manage me. So I take actions when I'm disturbed. What's the first action? When I'm disturbed, I realize I'm powerless. I'm responsible, but I'm powerless. So I pray. It's wonderful. The second action is to discuss it with somebody else. You see, step 10 is a repetition of steps 4 through 9. Living daily our way of living. Discuss it with somebody. But of course, if I'm disturbed, I've probably disturbed somebody else. I'm contagious that way. When I explode internally, normally it has external impact on my surroundings and the people in it as collateral damage. So many times I have to make an amend. But the final turning in step 10 is resolutely think about helping somebody else. Notice Bill doesn't tell us to help anybody. He said think about helping somebody else, knowing that we might be in a busy day or in a family event and we just can't at that point take any time out to do something that's not connected to our current responsibility. Be where your feet are. But when I begin thinking about somebody else, helping somebody else, something magical, and I'll use that term loosely, happens in me. And I'm released from my burden of self-centeredness, the bondage of self. And what happens? How does that look? I am released from my resentment. That's what forgiveness means. I referred to that book, Fred Luskin's book, but it comes as a total confirmation of my experience with the process of steps 4 through 9. in which I was released from my negative feelings, and I was willing to bring healing to other people through step 9 and the changes that I had committed to, making amends and repairing the damage. Page 68 in the big book says the antidote for fear is trust. Trusting in God, trusting in a benevolent universe, trusting in a power other than ourselves, or even at the very basic, trusting in ourselves. These are our various aspects of that domain of trust. Obviously, the opposite of dishonesty is honesty. Transparency, having our outsides and our insides match. And for me, the opposite of selfishness is the consideration of other people with no possible consideration for myself. As I mentioned earlier, my definition of altruism, doing something for somebody else with no possible benefit for myself. That's the purest of and the unconditional love that I believe is meant by the St. Francis prayer. This is emotional sobriety. It's a process, not an event. It's an experience, not a task. And it's slow, it's organic. But if we want happiness, we practice this balance. The balance at the biological level of pleasure and at the psychological level of meaning. This is how we're built as a human being. The brainstem needs satisfaction in sleep and food and drink and etc. At the body level, the limbic system, our emotions need to have contentment and equilibrium, which happens when we have a right and healthy relationship with reality. Our cortex, going back to the brain structure again, as I said, meaning comes from happiness comes from a sense of meaning and a context of helping and providing value to the people around us. The balance, the summary in each of the books, if I were to distill it out in the simplest terms, is to reduce suffering and increase joy. This is the source of happiness. It sounds so simple and so logical. Reduce suffering and increase joy. Remember what I said earlier. Bill said there's only 2 disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. Maybe there's only 2 disciplines in life. A power other than ourself or ourself. A power other than ourself or ourself. Bill said God or alcohol. I translated it into a power other than ourself, neutralizing the God terminology, and or self in terms of unmanageability. So what does it look like, this turning? What does it look like behaviorally? You can see this from the slide as I go forward progressively. Going from addiction to abstinence, going from resentment to love and forgiveness, going from fear to trust, going from inappropriate sex behavior to guided by principles. That's the magic of the sex inventory, the answer to question number 9. There's 9 questions in the sex inventory on page 69 in the big book. What should I have done instead? And under that, when we ask that question, we can determine our operating principles, the principles that are healthy for us. When I answer the question, what should I have done instead? Not back then when I was 20, but now that I'm 50. In the same circumstances, what would I want to do today? That determines and surfaces for me and reveals to me my operating principles. And I can cobble together then my sex ideal, the principles that will guide me in my current and my future behavior. Dishonesty, rigorous honesty, secrets, transparency, guilt and shame, freedom. The difference between guilt and shame is guilt is a negative feeling about what I do, and shame is a negative feeling about who I am. There's unhealthy guilt, and that's what we're talking about here. and there's unhealthy shame, and that's what we're talking about here. But there is healthy guilt and shame. You know, if you're a bank robber, you're guilty of robbing banks, etc. Unhealthy self-esteem turns into self-esteem. And I read a book on self-esteem. It was an excellent book. The one thing I remember that was so simple, so intuitive: if you want self-esteem, do esteemable things. Not about thinking self-esteem. It's not about visioning self-esteem. It's not about feeling self-esteem, although those are all important psychological implications. But it's about, how do your feet move? Do esteemable things, and you will begin to have a sense of value and personal esteem. Gerald May is one of the writers in the spiritual world. He's got many books on addiction and spirituality, and at least in his books, I saw him coin the phrases willfulness as the unhealthy use of the will, and willingness as the healthy use of the will. I have free will. If it's serving my needs in an unhealthy way, self-centeredness in the sense of narcissism, then it's unhealthy. But if it's using my free will to self-care and or to help somebody else rather than enabling, but really helping, then it's willingness in the healthy sense. I get the question all the time: what is God's will and what is my will? It's a fabulous question, one of discernment. It's a fancy word for thinking in the milieu of prayer. Embrace the attitude of set aside, opening up your mind and opening up your heart in a milieu of prayer, knowing that you can't do that sufficiently, but willing to have it done to us, and then take it into consideration. What's my will and what's God's will? Well, when I'm out of alignment, that's my will. When I'm in alignment, that's what I consider God's will, or aligning my will and my behavior with my perception of reality as it is. Aligning my will with reality as it is. That's emotional sobriety. What about spiritual sobriety? I'm just going to give us just a short tour of steps 11 and 12. You have to ask the question. Bill asks us to ask the question: is God necessary? You've seen the Sistine Chapel, perhaps, which this is a replica of here, with the God creator reaching down from earth, creating human beings. And it says in Genesis, that first book in the Torah, or the first book in the Hebrew scripture, Genesis, God made humans in God's image and likeness. God made them male and female. That's a quote, by the way. God made humans in God's image and likeness. God made them male and female. The name of the first man is not Adam. Adam is the Aramaic for earth, dirt. God made humans from dirt, Adam. I don't know where the word Eve came from. And as I mentioned, spirituality is a relationship, like a coin having two sides. Step 11 and step 12. Other-centered, with a power other than ourselves. Other-centered, with a contribution to humanity around us. This is spiritual sobriety. This man gave me a key to unlocking step 11 when he said, Bill asks us in step 11, pages 85 to 88, upon awakening, ask God to direct our thinking. Look up the word meditation in a dictionary. Meditation is directed thinking. Look it up in a dictionary. It is not no thinking. It is not emptiness. It is not silence. That's another practice. Meditation, as Bill understood it, he got from the Oxford group. And the Oxford group used meditation for guidance. They sat quietly asking God to guide them for their day and guide them for their life. Bill says we listen. What are we listening to? think about our day, consider our plans, what are we listening to? We're listening to our mind. So I ask God to direct my thinking. Then I listen to my thoughts as an answer to the prayer. It was the key that unlocked the door. I left the monastery in 1964 and I didn't meditate again for another 25 years. In 1988, this man said, you ask God to direct your thinking, then you begin thinking and you listen to your thinking. You listen to your thinking, and that's meditation. Listening to your thinking as an answer to the prayer, embedded in your thinking, is the way God speaks to us. God doesn't speak to me audibly through my ears, but intuitively through my inspiration or through my intuition or through my instincts, whether it's my thoughts or my feelings or my sensations or my awareness. Listen to the message through your own thinking. That's why we get quiet, to listen to our thinking. We don't try to silence our mind. We try to listen to what is it saying. Maybe in there is direction. Meditation is using my mind to think. Contemplation, which is what the Buddhists practiced and talked about in terms of emptiness and silence and a distance from the mind, that comes from the Latin word templare, which means temple space. Temple space, templare, contemplation, sitting in the presence, in the temple space, whether that be a church or a cathedral or a temple or a synagogue or a tent. Sitting in the temple space, in the presence of. Not with your mind thinking about it, but with your heart and soul and will in a loving stance, sitting in the presence of the presence, giving that presence permission to have its way with you. That's not in the big book, not even suggested in the big book, in the Step 11 practice, but it has become the other side of my practice. I use my mind in my meditation and I use my will in my contemplation. I sit in the presence of the presence as I would sit in sunlight to get a tan. There's no work involved. I invite the spirit to have its way with me. I don't give it any directions and I don't even think about it. It's not about a thought and it's not about a feeling. It's about an invitation, which I consent to, thy will be done. And that's how Bill concludes actually step 11 on page 88. Thy will be done. That's not passive. That's an active use of my will saying, God, I choose whatever it is that you choose for me. And I'm open to that. Bring me knowledge of your will and power to carry that out. It's phenomenal. It's an organic process that will change your life. Most teachers talk about 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night. If you're not doing any practice now and you want a practice of consciousness, start with 1 minute in the morning. Not 1 minute of reading, not 1 minute of writing, not 1 minute of praying. No, 1 minute of listening to your thinking. That's it, in the milieu of prayer. Maybe the set-aside prayer or the serenity prayer or the third step prayer or the seventh step prayer, doesn't matter. Pray the prayer and then sit and listen to your thinking for 1 minute. Set an alarm if you need to so that you're not distracted by the time. That's what I did in the beginning. And then I was led to 5 minutes into 15. And today my practice is probably 30 to 45 minutes in the morning and similarly at night. Show up and don't leave early. One of my teachers said, there's only 2 mistakes that you can make. Don't show up and leave early. So don't make those mistakes. If you are committed to an intentional consciousness practice, that's what I call it. I don't call it prayer. I don't call it meditation. I don't call it contemplation. I call it intentional consciousness. Hazelden asked me to do a book on meditation, which was published in 2017, Practicing the Here and Now. The first chapter describes all of this in detail. Show up and don't leave early. It's a method, not a technique. So we learned about the method, but it's an action based on faith. What is the assumption underneath? Do you actually believe that there is a power? Is the power a caring power? Is the universe a benevolent universe? These are powerful assumptions that are teased out in steps 2 and step 3. And awareness, not a feeling. Feelings are very important in living life. Feelings are very important in the psychological living. Feelings are critically important in emotional sobriety. Feelings are a trap in spiritual sobriety. Feelings are a trap, especially for addicts who like to feel good sooner than later and big and continuously. Feelings are a trap. More about that some other day. An experience, not a task. And that was one of the keys for me again that helped me a lot. And that is, my spiritual director said, Herb, you're very task oriented. Think this thought. You're as powerless over your spiritual life as you are over alcohol, having no power at all. You're as powerless over your meditation as you are over alcohol, having no power at all. Sit in the presence of power, humbled by your powerlessness. Inviting healing. That changed my life. Right there, my relationship to meditation changed because it's not something that I could do or should do. It's something I was willing to have done to me. But I had to show up and I had to sit and I had to use the tools and the methods and get some training and get some practice and have some accountability so that I got better intentionally over time. On leaving his office, he said, keywords. If you want to know if your meditation is effective, here you go. If you want to know if your meditation is effective, after 3 months of consistent daily meditation, ask your partner how you're treating her or him. Ask your partner if you've changed. Ask your partner about your kindness and your consideration. Pay attention to how you drive on the freeway. Pay attention to how you treat service personnel in the grocery store or at the bank. Because you will be kinder, you will be gentler, you will be softer, you will be more considerate over time. The change that comes from the 12 steps is, of course, a spiritual awakening. Read Appendix 2 if you have any doubt what that means. It's not a mountaintop experience like Bill had. A spiritual awakening is a change in the way we think and feel and behave. And it's done to us, not by us. That's the key, but not without us. That's that willingness and grace concept. Willingness is my part to make a decision to take the actions. Grace is that mystery that allows me to take that action. I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I don't know what comes first, the willingness or the grace. I took it into meditation again, like I do all conundrums, all questions that I ask, all mysteries that I try to resolve. I didn't resolve it, but I got a poem that helped me, consoled me, settled me down. I was taken to a place of willingness. Hear the grace of that. I was taken to a place of willingness, but I was willing to be taken. Hear the willingness on my part. Grace and willingness. I can't answer the question about the touch point in the Sistine Chapel of God's hand reaching down and my hand reaching up, because there's a space in the middle. That's the space of mystery. And I don't have to know, because when I stand quietly on the path that I've walked all these years and I look back over my shoulder, I see progressive enlightenment. I see progressive transformation. I see progressive awakening. My life flourishes and it continues to flourish. That's spiritual sobriety, a relationship with myself, a relationship with others, and a relationship with reality. It's got several parts. Certainly the 12-step program has several parts: meetings, big book, 12 steps, all important, prayer, certainly service, but the most important part, sponsorship, an accountability partner, a teacher. Most of the spiritual traditions talk about three components to a spiritual life. One is a path. The other is a community. But a critical component is a teacher, a sponsor, or an accountability partner. I needed people who were informed and experienced, and they weren't all in one place. I had a sponsor that helped me with my life. I had a step guide that helped me with the process. I had a therapist that helped me to iron out some of the wrinkles of my family of origin. I had a spiritual director who helped me plumb the depths of the spiritual journey. And I had a partner in a wife who was walking this path, and she was an accountability person for me, a person who I could trust with my money and my children and my soul. She died about 3 years ago, as many of you know, after 52 years of walking this journey. The first 20 were very challenging. And then we found the program, and the last 32 were phenomenal. We became really, really good friends. This is a process, not an event. Dr. Berger talked about integration. This is the key term in emotional and spiritual sobriety. And integration, physical sobriety begins like that dimmer switch going up a notch at a time, and we get emotional sobriety after we complete step 9. But we don't keep it and foster it unless we get spiritual sobriety, practicing our way of life on a daily basis. And the dimmer switch goes down a notch at a time also. And disintegration happens actually easier than integration. The dimmer switch is on a greased axle, and it's hardwired to go backwards. And so we need to lean gently into it. Bill says we have a daily reprieve. We're not cured. Daily reprieve. Each day, we need to use our mind to create our vision of God's will for us. Each day, we need to use our will to align our behavior and decisions, our thoughts and our feelings, with reality as it is. Otherwise, unmanageability dominates, and the spiritual malady corrupts, and the cancer of the soul metastasizes, and the obsession returns. And when the obsession returns, the darkness descends until it's fully dark and we're back in our addiction. The dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time, and it goes down a notch at a time. It doesn't seem like it's getting brighter when it is, until there's enough light to see. It doesn't appear that it's getting darker until, in fact, we don't see. That's where accountability partner is so important. Who is coming to save me? Dr. Berger introduced me to a psychologist who had a big sign over his office. He said, "Nobody's coming." Oh my God. How would you like to go and pay somebody that as you enter their door? Nobody's coming. I am the one that I am waiting for. That's the message here in emotional sobriety. I need to take responsibility, as Dr. Berger indicated, capable of making a response. I do that with my conscience practice, step 10, aware of my feelings, aware of my disturbance, taking responsibility for alignment and realignment. That's our self-actualization. A consciousness practice in the morning and in the evening, perhaps becoming a lantern. I am responsible for the effort, not the result. It's a journey, not a destination, a process, not a task, an experience, not an event. Oh, a recap of what I've been talking about. Self-actualization in step 10, but self-realization in step 11. Notice I'm connecting to that Maslow model of human development in terms of optimal development, the 3 stages at the top. But this final stage is who's coming to help them? This is an organic process. And the true litmus test is if we have this mindset of helping. I don't mean sponsoring. I don't mean even in the realm of 12 steps. I mean, do we have an attitude and the lenses through which we look of help? How can I help in the community that I find myself, in the vicinity of where I am? We are the one they are waiting for, becoming a lantern and lighting the path. It's a compassion practice, transmitting that light, as I talked about, the lantern that stands by the path, shining the light on the path so others can walk that path. Not about feelings, but an intention to actually help. If you have any problem determining whether you're enabling or helping, go to Al-Anon. They've made a science of that distinction. Helping will save and heal. Enabling will bring darkness and death. Self-transcendence, in the truest of sense, not ignoring yourself, but having this concept, this context of independence and interdependence that we talked about, lighting the path for others. A little thought about a practical approach to happiness as a daily practice is a commitment to intentional consciousness. Create a gratitude list, which you grow in positivity, a list that doesn't repeat itself. Put one thing on that list every day that you're grateful for, but never repeat it. I mean, never repeat it. At some point, 30 to 60 days after you've listed 30 to 60 items, you're going to have to be quite creative and innovative about what you're grateful for. This is the stretch that creates that positive orientation, that positive habituation. Of course, prayer, asking not to change God, but to be changed. Not to bring healing to others, but to be healed yourself. And meditation to get the guidance that we need and to get the power that we need and to get the direction in helpful actions and to be kind. I just read a book on loving kindness by Rami Shapiro. He's a rabbi who's in the 12-step program, and he's written from the Jewish perspective an interpretation of the 12 steps, which he has a separate book on that, but his book on loving kindness. Those are the lenses now that I've chosen to look through, the two lenses: loving, my attitude; kindness, my actions. And I have accountability partners, as I've mentioned before, several depending on the circumstances for all of my commitments. This is emotional and spiritual sobriety. Emotional sobriety is me self-regulating, managing the fire of my instincts and my emotions. In California, we have fires that are out of control. Fires out of control are a bad thing, destructive. Fires in my oven and in my fireplace are really good things. The difference is containment. The fire of my instincts and the fire of my emotions are contained by my cortex, my thinking, my knowing, and my deciding and my actions.
So I'll kind of discuss some of the things that Herb just talked about steps 10 and 11 and 12. So let me start, is that Herb and I have often called, and I think rightfully so, is step 10 is in a step for emotional sobriety. And why is that? Why does that? You know, Bill said all the steps are to achieve emotional sobriety, and we don't want to minimize the impact of the rest of the steps because they all play a role in achieving emotional sobriety. But what is it about step 10 that specifically is important to the emotional sobriety? So one of the things that has happened is that as we are growing in maturity, we are letting go of the need to blame. Whether it's to blame ourselves, oh my God, I should have been like this, I should have been like that, or to blame others. They should have been like this or like that.
Right.
I mean, that either self-blame or the blame of others gets us, keeps us stuck. It keeps us from learning from our experience. Because what we're doing is we're trying to figure out who's at fault for what just happened instead of understanding what just happened and to see what we can learn from it. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of dropping blame from your language, just like you're trying to drop shoulds or supposed to's from your language.
Yeah.
There's no role in it for an emotional sobriety. It is very destructive. It's going to keep you stuck and immature. It's going to make your relationships very difficult. I mean, it's going to keep you defensive. When you're blaming yourself, you're going to create all kinds of shame or self-hate. I mean, shame comes from that we're not living up to some idea of who we should be. I mean, so it's such an important part. And so what we're taught to do is in step 10 is continue to take personal inventory, you know, and when wrong, promptly admitted it, right? So it's all about taking responsibility. And that is the heart and soul of emotional sobriety.
Yeah.
I am 100% responsible for myself. I'm 100% responsible for the existence I create, regardless of what's happened to me, regardless of what kind of trauma I've walked through, doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in one sense that I have to deal with that stuff, but what matters the most is my relationship to the experience I'm having.
That is such an important concept, Alan, and I hope you're going to explore it a little more broadly too. Yeah.
Well, I want to, because see, you know, everything that Herb was talking about were tools for us to become the determining force in our own lives. Everything he gave you was some technology, right? It was a way of you being able to have a different relationship with yourself, a different relationship with others, a different relationship with your mystery, so that you become the determining force in your lives. My emotional dependency makes me the victim of what everybody else is doing.
And even though I was victimized, my father, my mother, emotional, physical abuse, it's all true. My spouse, betrayal, emotional, physical abuse, it's all true. It's all true. It's all true. You were a victim. The key word is you were.
Yeah.
You are not now.
That's right. Well, the key to that is that you could take every one of these experiences, and I know what you've done with the work you've done, let's say with your dad. Yeah. Starting with LifeSpring, starting with the work we did in my office, is you digested that experience and you took your power back.
Yeah.
And there's a way to do that. But you've got to do that through experiencing your feelings, finding your voice, finding the words you didn't have. And that's why, when I said earlier today, one of the reasons that emotional sobriety did not take hold is because it requires going down and doing the work.
Interesting. It requires taking personal responsibility.
It does. And what we've done, unfortunately, is we've taken some of these great spiritual principles that we have, and we've used them to bypass the emotional work that we need to do.
Of course.
And that's been the stuck point for us collectively in recovery.
Yeah.
Is that the difficulty we have in opening ourselves up to the pain that we feel, opening ourselves up to the feelings of inadequacy, of uncertainty, of being lost, of rage, or whatever it is that we haven't worked through, needs to be worked through. You know, Herb did a great job earlier when he was talking about one of the experiences he's had through his growth, and I've seen it. People are pushing his buttons less. And the reason that's happening is because he's not walking around holding them up like this. So they're not there. He's dealt with those buttons. He's resolved the issues. So he doesn't have those buttons. He doesn't have the expectations he had before on how people were supposed to be and how they should act and all those other things. He's let go of so much of that. Nobody's going to do this 100%, but it's so much more. I mean, when I first met him, the word serenity wouldn't even stand close to him. I mean, it would run away from him because there was no room for it. And now he exudes that. I mean, the vibes that come from it is a man who's come to peace with himself and has now found a new purpose in life. So I just want to say that in terms of what we're talking about too, and then I'll shut up and let you guys raise your questions. Is the other part of this is that being grounded, as we talked about, comes from finding a new purpose in life. And that becomes an extremely important thing. It's before our purpose was so self-centered. It was all about me. And this is one of the reasons why in relationships, we end up taking so much personally, because we make it all about us. And I'll give you one more thing, and then when Herb and I do the part 2 to this, I'll elaborate on it a lot more. I think an outstanding book that I would consider to be a required reading for emotional sobriety is The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And he's got 4 agreements that lead to what he calls emotional freedom. Yeah. And what are we talking about with emotional sobriety? Emotional freedom, right? And the second agreement in his book, first agreement is be impeccable with your word. But he's not thinking about it in terms of relationship with other people. He's talking about it in relationship to yourself. He says the true meaning of sin is when you violate your own word with yourself. Yeah. His second agreement is don't take anything personally. And he spends so much time saying not a thing that happens is personally. But if I make it about me, there's my button. If it's all about me, you can push my button at any time. And he said, nothing that somebody does is about you. It's about them. Yeah. And he says that if you do take it personally, it's because you got an issue there, not because of what they've done. Is you got an unresolved issue. If they said that you're self-centered and you get offended by that, it might be because you haven't looked at your self-centeredness. You know, if they say something to you that hurts your feelings, it might be that you've got some feelings that were hurt as a child that you've never worked through. Nothing is about you except what you need to deal with to not make it about you. So there's 2 things. What they're doing is what they're doing. That has nothing to do with you, and how you react has nothing to do with them. Both of those things are true in terms of not taking things personally. By the way, another important element. So get a hold of Don Miguel Ruiz's book and especially focus on that, not taking things personally and not making any kinds of, assumptions about things. I mean, those 2 things become important things. We're warned about that when we say contempt prior to investigation in the big book. Bill was talking about keeping your emotional balance there. All right, so enough said about all that. Let us open this up. We've got about 25 more minutes. We can handle some questions from you, and then Herb and I will make an announcement, and we will do a part 2 to exploring emotional sobriety.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's been just really excellent, and I can't wait for part 2. And I just want to say that, Herb, you mentioned you were 80 twice, and I kept thinking, I thought you were joking. Oh. So definitely don't look 80. I wanted to just comment on a couple of things and on their questions, but I usually struggle with getting the question out. But live where your feet are. I love that, but struggle with more of a wandering mind, and wanting to know more about what you think of that. And the other thing you said, which are feelings are a trap, especially for addicts. For me, my biggest struggle is wanting to get out of where I am, not wanting to be where I am, even though where I am is a great place and everything that one could wish for. And if there's, anything you can say, either one of you, thoughts on how to reverse that, I want to do the opposite of that. I don't want to, I want to be happy where I am, not looking at everything around me, for, oh, they look like they have a really great, life and family. I want to go over here and be with them, kind of like, doing that. And I'm trying to make sense of that in my head. And that's it.
Alan?
Well, I was going to comment on your process. You do have trouble with questions. It's
Yes,
a
I
very interesting thing. Do you understand that at all in terms of what the trouble is?
I don't. I just know that there's a lot in my head and trying to get it out, and I just don't know how to get it out. And it's probably because I don't know how to ask for what I need, or I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to find my voice. I'm not sure.
Well, yeah. See, that's. I think that's it. You see, there is a lack of clarity on your part. There's no question about it. There's something else that happens. You have trouble asking a question because you're also answering it at the same time.
Interesting. Yeah. All right.
It's an impossibility. You can't do it. See, it just doesn't work. A question is to get information, not to give it. And you don't know how to separate those two.
So would that be somewhere a sense of lack of confidence in terms of
I don't know.
I don't want to reveal myself?
I don't know the why of it, but I'm more focused on the how of it, right?
Yeah.
What you're doing, right? So it's just, so for you, what I'd say, right? See, forget everything you just said about your questions. Forget the questions. Your process is to pay attention to what you're doing right now. And right now, you need to get clear of your thoughts and separate them from your question. That's how you're going to get the clarity you're looking for. It can't work the way you're doing it. You take them and you just weave them together so that it's not clear at all what you want and what you're asking for, because it's so mixed with your opinions. So for you, I would say before I even ask a question, I'd write down my opinion I'd write my question down, write down my opinion about it. And then when you go to ask it, just read the question. Get rid of your opinion, because that's not what you're looking for. You're not looking to just get your opinion validated. You're looking for new information, and I can hear that. But you've got to do a better job, or you're not going to get what you want from life. So this is what everybody needs to pay attention to, is that what Herb and I are talking about is using your awareness to be more effective in being able to show up in your life.
And the term I use, other than awareness, is consciousness. They're the same word, but it's about fostering consciousness. The steps 4 through 9 remove the obstacles to consciousness, or they make me more aware of or conscious of my unawareness. And that then makes it more conscious. Yep.
Next time, we'll be looking forward to your questions.
I think I may have the same problem, and you guys really just made it make sense to me. But sometimes I'm trying to answer my own questions, and that's why I don't get any answers, because I'm just trying to do it all. But I love what.
But pause there. That's a great observation. Maybe that's part of what's going on. Is that feeling that somebody's not going to be there for you, so you got to do it all yourself. See, what you just said, I want you to stop and really hear. Is that maybe your experience is that it's hard to believe somebody can really be there for you. And really take that in a minute, because that is what might create that for you.
I agree. I think that I just sometimes maybe can't rely on people. And over the time, I had to rely just on me, but I don't have the answers. I am so open to everything. I've always been.
It creates a real double bind for yourself, right? Because what happens is you continue to do that, you don't create space for anybody to be there. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for you. You keep going on and generating the same thing without the experience of people being there, never realizing that you're the one that's like Herb holds up the bars. You're on the other side of the door, keeping the door shut.
I agree. I also feel what I love also that was said, that Herb put up, the consciousness that created the problem can't be the consciousness that solves the problem. I find I really try to find out how I got myself into a situation or why something isn't working out. And and this is all AA related. I've always been spiritual. I've always believed in God. I thought before I got sober 4.5 years ago, or not quite 4.5, but I just thought God just gave up on me. AA made me realize, no, that's not true. I gave up on me. He was just waiting for me to come back. That's how I look at it. But today I'm able to separate, but I love that you can't solve the problem with the same thought process that got you there. You know, there's just so much here, but probably the most the tiny whispering sound, changing that verbiage, how I use it, like, you know, the voice in my head. I love the verbiage of tiny whispering sound, because that's exactly what I feel. It's a tiny little voice. And if I go too fast or something else pops in my head, I'm not hearing that tiny little voice. It just is gone. So you're right. I have to stand still long enough to really listen to it. But my favorite, the spiritual intervention, I am going to start asking when things are tough for God, for my spirit to have this spiritual intervention to come into me and help me figure it all out, because I can't do it. Again, my favorite was the question thing, that I'm answering my own question. I need to get rid of my opinion and let somebody else help me. So thank you guys. And I can't wait for
hold on. But see, stop. So you're doing it now. It's so God's sakes, it's so true. It's so it's amazing that you're right in the process right now. You don't even realize how you think you're pulling your covers on it, but you're doing it as you're pulling your covers. It's such an interesting dynamic. So look, this is what I would say to you, is to think about it, is what are you protecting yourself from? Mm-hmm. See, that I think is the question for you here. And what might it be? When I say that to you, if you allowed yourself to be vulnerable and you just put out there what you needed and waited and didn't feel like you had to take control and waited to see if someone could be there for you, what are you protecting yourself from when you don't do that?
I'm protecting myself from being very hurt, because I keep getting.
That's right. And see, and I think the issue becomes one of, and this is where you need to look at your relationship to your pain about that, is how come you don't have more faith in yourself to be able to deal with being hurt? What is it about being hurt that makes it such an undesirable thing that it drives so much of this behavior that makes you lonely all the time?
Wow.
Yeah, well, that's right.
See, so I think there's a big lie going on inside of you that you can't handle being hurt. And that's what you got to look at, is your relationship to that, you know, can you feel pain? Can you allow yourself to have that pain? Can you learn how to soothe yourself? See, a lot of times we don't have pain because we do that blame thing I was talking about. Look at what's wrong with me, or look at what's wrong with them, instead of just saying, well, I'm disappointed. I'm not getting what I want here. And it was important to me. How do I know it's important? If I don't get it, then I just cry about it. That's okay. That's how we're wired. You cry when something happens that's disappointing to you. You get to cry about it. You just get to feel bad for a while.
Thank you. That's really deep. I'm going to look at this very differently. Thank you.
You need to really look at your relationship to your pain differently, because that's, to me, that is underneath this thing, is that whole operation is to protect yourself from that.
Yes.
And you don't need it. It's creating a terrible loneliness in your life that keeps you isolated and alienated from really what you want.
Thank you.
I have a question about what was discussed early on within the first hour about maturity. And it's within the context of my marriage. When there's a crisis, I wrote down, we must adapt. We want to survive. There are instincts and that we learn from a very early age and that we apply them. And then it's up to us from that point forward to raise our awareness, recognize that they may not be healthy, and then begin putting ourselves on a path of recovery and explore other forms of behavior. But within the context of a relationship, that's often, I find it very difficult, my particular relationship, my marriage, in that, we're not on the same path. One person appears to, I'm trying to do my best to care for myself and put myself on a recovery path, and trying to exercise acceptance of my wife. And so I find that a lot of what is discussed is about relationships, codependence, and you both of you have touched on many different things. And so my question to you is, could you comment about this particular situation when there is a crisis, when we're stripped of many of our tools and we're having to scrabble around to try to learn new ways of coping with, albeit addicts around you, mental illness and incurable diseases being introduced in your family, all kinds of things like this.
Why don't you take a shot at it, Herb, and then I'll.
I was thinking I was going to dump that one on you.
On me, huh? Well, here's the first thought that.
Because it sounds really complicated.
It is a bit
much deeper than as was expressed.
Yeah. Here's what I think is might be going on, and you just see if this fits for you. But this is what my intuition says, is that you have this idea that somehow that you and your wife have to be less different than you are to be okay. And you're struggling with that. Is that you're on one path and you see her on another path, and you're wondering how in any way can we build a relationship if we're in such different places. Now, one of the things that I think, if you listen to Bill's letter and you really take into heart what we're talking about with emotional sobriety, and that is that the more maturity I have, the greater my respect for differences becomes. And I don't need anyone to be in the same place I'm at. I just have to be able to be in my place and to be able to put myself in their shoes, or to develop what we call empathy. Right? Empathy is my ability to stick myself in somebody else's shoes, give up my egocentric position, and see the world from their side for a moment. When I can do that, I can have a relationship with anyone. I don't have a requirement that they need to think or feel or act any kind of a way. Now, does that mean I'm going to marry everyone who's different than I am? I'm not saying that part. Right. But I am saying that I think for you, maybe the next step is how to stay close to your wife and still be different, and not let the differences alienate you. That's what I heard in what you were saying.
Right. I appreciate that. I don't want to get too personal at this forum, but you mentioned when there's a crisis that we're adapting. And I think often that happens is because I do attend many 12-step meetings that have been mentioned here that deal with family members that are suffering. And I hear and see a lot of members that are literally in a PTSD frozen kind of condition. They're just scrabbling for what kind of new coping skills. And so is that what I understood from the phrase that you were made?
I think we're always adapting. I think that's true. And see, we just want, Herb talked about the three instincts we have, right? What were they? They were to fight, flight, or freeze, right? The three F's. So where they become maladaptive in terms of emotional sobriety is when we use them for solutions.
Yeah.
See, none of them are actually very useful for us. So even though they're hardwired in us, is Herb was talking about, we've got to use our cortex to rise above being the Neanderthals that we all are.
Yeah.
Right? That's what he was saying. So even though my thing might be to want to pull away or run away or control, if I live in the pause, I might think, well, what if I try something different? What if I just try to sit here and have empathy for a while? What if I just feel my pain? Because a lot of times I'm running away to avoid my feelings. And I'm running away by either running away, the emotional cutoff, controlling someone is another form of running away, pleasing someone is another form of running away. They're all running away because I'm not staying with what's going on with me.
Or even trying to solve their life problems.
That's running away too, right?
It's totally run, and it's unrealistic, and it may not be my role and responsibilities. It's hard to watch other people suffer, especially if they're close to us.
And that's it. There it is. What Herb just said is learn how to sit and let yourself suffer that.
And maybe that's the definition of my spiritual awakening right there.
There it is.
That's part of my change.
Yeah.
That's it. Is just to allow yourself that makes you human.
Yeah.
You know, how do we know we love someone? Well, if something's going on, it hurts.
Yeah.
Loving hurts. This idea loving's great all the time is Fantasyland. That's Disneyland stuff. Disneyland is closed, by the way.
Yeah.
Disneyland is closed. In case anybody's wondering, don't go. Turn your tickets in. It's closed. Let's grow up now.
Yeah.
Loving's gonna hurt, and good loving hurts a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
Don't run from that kind of loving, because then you're gonna really die. You're gonna die another kind of death, and it's not a good one.
Yeah.
It's just a constant state of fear because.
Well, that's what it creates. Is if I don't embrace that feeling, then I got to be afraid of it.
I thought I was done with it when my my loved ones who were suffering from addiction started to get better, and I thought that I was done imagining day to day them potentially dying. Now I'm in a different fear, imagining that I may lose my marriage.
Yeah.
It's just a constant state.
That's it. But see, what I don't know which poet who said it, but something like, "Who's ever not killed in love is dead meat." That's a great one.
And the problem with the stance of fear is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's right. And it creates that alienation and loneliness.
Yeah.
See, that's what we're talking about.
It'll create the exact outcome that you're afraid will happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And see, that's one of the things that happens in emotional sobriety. We now develop an awareness of how we're creating our existence.
That's it.
That's what we're talking about. And when I become aware of that, that's not going to be good news all the time. I'm going to realize, my God, I've been wanting a glass of water, and every time I go to pick it up, I knock it off the table instead of picking it up. I've been doing that my whole life. My God, the pain that comes from that awareness is huge. But Herb and I have seen that if you don't suffer that pain, you can never integrate it.
Yeah.
You can never grow from it. Because once you suffer that and you realize, my God, I've kept myself thirsty my whole life by that behavior, that's when something new starts to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. The Oxford group calls their process soul surgery.
That's it.
That's what we're talking about here.
I heard something early on in the meeting where somebody was talking about being control freaks. And I started to look at that and think, oh my gosh, I used to call that PTSD. Now at the end of this meeting, I'm thinking it doesn't matter whether I'm being a control freak or it's coming from PTSD. In either case, I've got to think higher about it to get out of it because I'm keeping myself out of life. So it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
That's a tremendous insight. That's exactly right. It does matter what we do and how we react. It doesn't matter what we name it. And so I like that a lot.
Okay. And then something you said, sir, that just kind of broke through me and I loved. I had a profound awareness in my life a few years ago where I realized that my prayer of thanksgiving, of gratitude, is how I behave every day. And you said something about, let me find it real quick. I wrote a little note. You said that our belief in meditation is whether or not we're doing it.
Yeah.
Same idea. I have all these great philosophical ideas, but my feet don't quite meet the ground on acting on them. So do I really mean that or not?
Yeah.
And that gives you a lot to look at and think about. And I thank you for that.
It's a life-changing question.
I'm sorry?
It's a life-changing question.
It is life-changing.
Yeah.
It is life-changing. So thank you for posing that to me. That gives me a lot to work on right there. Thank you.
You know, the spiritual awakening of that is that you heard it and are willing to accept it as a possible truth, and that shows a sign of an open heart.
Well, to me, spiritual awakening is my greatest joy. We can always go one layer deeper, and then we pause there a while and think we kind of got it whipped until we realize there's one layer deeper.
Yeah,
and it's
that's why I like the dimmer switch concept.
Yes.
There's always more light.
And God sort of lets words sizzle for me when I'm supposed to be hearing it. And your words sizzled for me on that subject. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I've got work to do.
I have a couple of questions. I heard you say, maybe you and Dr. Berger both said, I run away from constant battles, I have 4 siblings. There's a constant need to minimize. I'm not meeting their expectations. My house is not right. I don't look right. I did it down and on and on and on. Or and we go to the other extreme. If I'm too firm in my boundaries, how do I find a middle ground? Because
middle ground to what?
To having a relationship with my siblings, because my instinct.
Stop caring what they think.
Stop what?
Stop caring what they think.
How do I do that?
Oh, I don't know. Why is it important to you what they think?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm sure you don't actually. But that's the question. See, I don't have a lot of answers, but I have a lot of questions. And I can help you ask the right question. And then as you pursue the right question, a healthy question, then you maybe come up with a healthy answer. I don't actually know what the answer is, but just in the short time that we've just talked, I could tell that the right question is that you think too highly of what they think of you and you allow them to name you.
Okay.
Yeah. So have you read the book Codependent No More, Melody Beattie?
A long time ago.
Well, it might be worthwhile dusting it off and rereading it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're valuing their opinion too highly.
Okay.
And there's a reason for it. I don't know what that is, and maybe you don't either, but it'll be very helpful to you to find out and then determine whether or not that's how you want to live.
A part of it right now, I can say, is I'm the medical power of attorney for my mom, who's almost 93. And I run a I have one of my sisters is the executor and has the, whatever the other power is called. And she minimizes and questions everything I do and goes to the doctor or somebody, the caregiver, where my mom is behind my back and undermines me. So I'm kind of like, okay.
Yeah, I've seen things like that get very complicated, and that it might require some type of professional intervention where there is an arbitrator that sits with you and educates everybody as to the lines of communication. But again, I don't want to jump into a solution before you're very clear on what the problem is. But I can see the problem is very complicated and very real and has consequences. So yeah, there are solutions to this. I don't know what they will be, but you're asking the right questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
But it sounds to me like it's something that you on your own are not going to resolve. You at least need sponsor help.
Yes.
Yeah, an experience, and maybe not just a sponsor, but an experienced person who can help you sort out the dynamics here.
You know, just listening just now, I'm thinking that part of our problems here is that we're all looking for answers, and what you're providing.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. I understand it. Go ahead.
What you're providing is questions.
Yes, I am.
And you know, that's the root. You know, that difference between an answer and a solution, and questions are the route to solutions.
Nice.
And so anyway, I'm just, you know, I'm always looking for answers. I want my problem to be gone.
Yeah, of course.
And to be removed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to happen unless really I ask the right questions and then act on my answers.
Yeah, I've not heard that distinction before, and I really like it. There's a difference between an answer and a solution. I really like that. Yeah, and the way you've presented it, it's I'm going to incorporate that because it's really helpful. The questions are, because that comes out of my own experience. I did not have the correct questions in me, but when I found experienced people, they helped me ask the right questions. They didn't give me answers, but they knew from their experience the questions that would help me come to some knowledge, some answers, some action, and then the solution. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I guess you could say either answers are either individual answers or they're the result of action.
It's kind of a yes, no. It's right on the money. There's a connection to knowledge and action that creates an experience and a solution. Yeah.
I also just wanted to give a shout out to your 12-step telephone workshops that I've done 1.5 times, and I want to do it again. Will you be starting again in January, February?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's a bit of a complicated answer, but I'll make it short. And the answer is yes. I'll be starting a new workshop on Monday that will have, at least in my current development, it will be a teaching on Monday and a meeting on Tuesday that will be a one coin, two sides type thing. So they're an integrated process, both Monday and Tuesday night. The regular weekly workshop that I've been doing for several years, I do 3 that will start again in July of next year. The current ones will end by June of next year. But to answer your question directly, if somebody's interested to get started in the work of the big book, Monday in January we'll start. I'm doing a whole new format, which will be a teaching for an hour for an hour, and then on Tuesday a dialogue about that teaching. So I'm expanding the work to make it, I believe, more helpful to people. Although it does suggest consecutive meetings, which might not be helpful. So it's an experiment. First time I've had a chance to articulate that. Sorry for the awkwardness.
Very articulate to me. And that'll be on the telephone?
Be Zoom. Yes.
And how can we find out how to sign up for that?
Oh, you're going to get more information than you ever wanted. Right, Tanya?
Beautiful. Thank you, Herb.
Yeah, you will all be receiving information. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the advertisement.
But I heard you say it years ago, and it's why I'm still here after a few years, you know, and that was no one's coming.
Yeah.
Want to make sure I'll repeat that just because maybe it's an opportunity for everyone to hear it that didn't hear it, but for me, it really meant something because, yeah, my unhappiness was, I blamed everyone else for my unhappiness. And I just remember how I felt about my situation and what I thought life was. And that was that I used to say that people can't change, but I was talking about other people, and I didn't realize that, that was going to end up being directed at me. And then once I did this work, and how different my life is now, and my perspective and my perception of reality. So it's a gift, you know, it's a gift that I got here, and it's a gift to be here today. And yeah, I guess a big thank you to you, you know, for everything you do for so many people. And I mean, I don't know where I would be, and I've said that I feel like I'd be dead. So
yeah, or somebody would shoot you,
or I would have shot myself, I guess. Yeah,
that was a joke.
Yeah, and yeah, I've never had those thoughts really about ending my own life, but no, I think I would have imploded. I really do feel like that with everything that's happened in my life, and the fact that I got the 12 steps got in the way. They began to change the curve, the trajectory of where I was headed.
That's right.
Before some things happened that I don't feel like I would have been able to navigate without
I
it.
agree.
No matter like where I was and what I was like, whoa, like, how do you explain that? So I'm thankful.
Yep.
And thank you. So
thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. I've got to do let me say two things. I want to announce two things real quick. I do a podcast with Tom Rutledge called Start Right Here. Conversations about what matters most. Start right here. Conversations about what matters most. If you put my name in, you could pull up the podcast. We record one every week. On Thursday nights, when COVID started, I decided I wanted to do something to give back, because I think we're all struggling and with this craziness. I started an Emotional Sobriety Anonymous meeting that is on 7 p.m. every Thursday night. I'm going to give you the Zoom code. And Tanya, if you could post this in the chat, that would be appreciated. So it's Thursday night, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 330-149-513. 330-149-513, password 375-986. 375-986. Herb and I and Tommy Rosen recorded an amazing program about a month ago, and it's on the amplifiedrecovery.com website. That recording is available for sale. It is, I think, some of the best work that Herb and I and with Tommy that we've done together. It's really worth the $97 that it costs to get it. So I'll look forward to seeing everybody next time. If you liked what we did here today, please share it with others. If you didn't, share it with others anyway. In Hollywood, any press is good press, right? Any publicity is good press. So if you hated us, talk about it too, because any press is good press. All right, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks very much. All right, so everybody, thank you. You'll be notified of the forthcoming events as we promised we'll have, and I look forward to having you back. So thanks everybody for joining us today.